On the 6th of June, 1816, a 9-year-old girl in Vermont looked out her bedroom window and saw snow on the corn. She went downstairs and found her mother standing at the kitchen door, holding a cup of coffee in both hands, looking at the same thing. The corn had been in the ground for 25 days. It had been up for 12. It was 6 inches tall and the color of new grass, and it was covered in snow. The girl asked her father, when he came in from the field, if summer had come yet. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said yes. Summer had come. He was not lying. He was doing what fathers did when they had no better answer, which was give the one that got them through the morning. By noon, the snow was gone, but the corn was not what it had been. The leaves that had been bright and stiff were pale and soft in the way that told anyone who had farmed long enough exactly what had happened inside them. The cold had gotten in. The damage was done. No one in Vermont that morning knew why. They did not know about a mountain on the other side of the world that had destroyed itself 14 months earlier, throwing 50 million tons of invisible material into the upper atmosphere. Material that had been circling the globe ever since, thinning the sunlight, stealing warmth from every field in the northern hemisphere, without anyone being able to see it or name it or stop it. They only knew that June had snow in it, and that the corn was dying, and that winter was 8 months away. This is the story of what it felt like to live through the year that followed. It is the story of one family in Addison County, Vermont, and of the scale that went on the kitchen table in August and did not come off until November, and of the account book with the back pages where a woman wrote down things she was watching but not yet ready to name, and of a jar of seed corn that was moved from the back shelf to the front shelf on a night in May when no one else was awake. It begins 16 months before that June morning, in the spring of 1815, when the cellar was full and the sky gave no sign of what it was already carrying. The field was back. Ruth Carey stood at the kitchen door in the early morning of April and looked at it the way you looked at something you had not been sure you would see again. The soil was dark and soft and wet from the night's rain. The apple tree at the far edge of the north field had put out its first small leaf, pale green and no bigger than a thumbnail, trembling a little in the morning air. The sky was the color of good weather coming. She was holding a cup of coffee in both hands. Inside the house, behind her, Thomas was still sleeping. May was still sleeping. The fire she had built an hour ago had taken hold, and the kitchen was warm in the way a kitchen was supposed to be warm in April. When the worst of winter was done, and the ground was soft enough to work, and the days were getting long enough to matter, she looked at the chair beside the door. The empty one. She looked at the north field again. There were things missing from this farm that had been here a year ago. A fence post on the east side, sold in January for the money it brought. 2 of the 6 hens, gone the same way. A set of harness buckles. A wool blanket. A small hand mirror that had belonged to her mother. You did not notice a farm emptying out when it was happening. You only noticed afterward. When you looked at the spaces where things used to be, the coffee was getting cold. She did not drink it. She just held it. Somewhere out past the north field, the river was running. She could hear it if she listened. Low and steady. The sound of snowmelt coming down from the mountains, the way it came every April. That sound was the same as it had always been. That was something. She thought about the jar of seed corn in the cellar. 40 pounds, bought in March. More than they had planted in any year she could remember. Thomas had looked at the number in her account book and not said anything. He had understood without being told what the number meant, which was that she was not going to let a year like the last one happen twice if she could help it. The sun came over the tree line. It came the way it was supposed to come in April, with actual warmth in it, the kind you felt on your face and arms, the kind that meant something to seeds in the ground and calves in the barn, and a woman standing in a doorway who had spent the better part of a year watching the sky and not trusting what she saw. She trusted it now, not completely. Maybe not ever completely again, but enough to go back inside and start breakfast. Enough to call May down from her room. Enough to be ready. When Thomas came in from checking the barn and said what she already knew he was going to say. "Ground's soft," he said. "We could turn it today." "Yes," she said. "We could." She put the cold coffee down and picked up a fresh one. Outside, the field waited. The apple tree held its new leaves up toward a sun that had finally, after everything, decided to come back. This is the story of the year before that morning. It begins in January of 1816, when the cellar was full and the sky gave no sign of what it was carrying. The cellar was the first thing Ruth checked every morning. Not because she was worried, because it was hers to know. She went down before anyone else was awake, holding the lamp low so the light fell across the shelves rather than in her eyes. And she counted the way she always counted, not with a list, but with her hands, touching each thing and knowing without writing it down where they stood. 40 pounds of cornmeal in the sack on the left, 18 pounds of dried beans in the stoneware crock with the chipped lid, 3 barrels of salt pork, the top layer of each one still firm and white, 2 smaller crocks of pickled turnip, a row of corked bottles along the back wall, each one sealed with wax, each one labeled in her own hand, rye flour in the bin by the stairs. Enough for 3 more months if she was careful. 4, if she stretched it, she was always careful. She had not needed to stretch it in 9 years of marriage. Not once, but she kept the skill sharp the way you kept any skill sharp, because the day you needed it was never the day you expected. She came back up the stairs and started the fire. By the time Thomas came in from the barn, the kitchen was warm and the oatmeal was on, and May was sitting at the table in her nightgown asking about snow. There had been snow in the night, a clean inch of it on the fence rails and the woodpile and the roof of the henhouse. And May, at 9 years old, still found snow worth discussing. "Is it the last snow?" she asked. "No," Ruth said. "How do you know?" "Because it is January." May considered this. "When is the last snow?" "April, most years. Sometimes March, if we are lucky." "That is a long time." "Yes," Ruth said. "It is." Thomas came in and pulled off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door. He smelled of hay and cold air and the particular smell of the barn in winter, which was not unpleasant, which Ruth had stopped noticing years ago, the way you stopped noticing the smell of your own house. He sat down and she put a bowl in front of him, and he looked at it and then looked out the window at the snow. "Ground is solid," he said. "It is January. Ruth said. He smiled at that. A small one, the kind he kept mostly to himself. He had been smiling that way for as long as she had known him, which was 20 years, and she had spent the first 5 of those years thinking she was missing something, and the next 15 understanding that she was not. Eli came down last, the way Eli always came down, which was at the exact moment when it was possible to eat without being the person who set the table. He was 16, and growing, and hungry, in the continuous way that boys that age were hungry. And he sat down and ate without speaking, which was also how boys that age ate. He had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and a quality of stillness about him that was unusual in a boy his age, and that Ruth suspected had something to do with the fact that he spent a lot of time thinking about things he had not yet said out loud. On the shelf by the window was a folded piece of newspaper. She had noticed it there for 2 weeks. She had not asked him about it. After breakfast, Thomas went back out to the barn. Eli stayed at the table with his school book, or appeared to. Ruth washed the bowls and watched him from the corner of her eye. After a while, he put the school book down and picked up the newspaper and unfolded it and read something at the bottom of the page. Then he folded it back up and put it on the shelf. She dried her hands and picked up the newspaper and looked at the page he had been reading. A notice. Land in Ohio. Good soil. Long, growing season. Affordable to a man willing to work. She read it twice. She put it back on the shelf exactly as she had found it. She went to the window and looked out at the farm. Thomas was crossing the yard toward the woodpile, his breath coming white in the cold air. The fields were white and still. The barn roof was heavy with snow. The fence lines ran straight from the house to the tree line, the way she had watched them run every winter for 9 years. Eli was 16. Ohio was 400 miles. January was a long time before spring. She went back to the kitchen and took stock of the afternoon's work. Bread to bake. A hem to finish on May's school dress. A letter to write to her sister in Massachusetts that she had been putting off for 3 weeks. She was not worried about the newspaper notice. A boy of 16 read notices about Ohio the way he read everything else that was not Vermont, which was with a kind of appetite that did not yet know the difference between wanting something and being ready for it. She had been that age once. She remembered the appetite. She put the bread dough on to rise and sat down with her sister's letter and began to write. Outside. Vermont in January was exactly what Vermont in January had always been. Cold and white and quiet, the days short and the nights long and the cellar full and the family fed and the fire going and the spring still months away, but absolutely certain to come. She wrote to her sister about the winter, about May's questions, about Thomas and the new calf. She did not mention the newspaper notice. There was nothing to mention yet. The bread rose on the counter. The snow outside stayed on the fence rails. White and clean, and exactly as expected, because January in 1816 was, in every way that anyone in Vermont could see or measure or feel, a winter that felt like all the others. In the cellar, the stoneware crocks sat on their shelves in the dark, patient and full, holding everything the family had put away against a winter that was turning out to be exactly what a winter was supposed to be. Ruth finished the letter, sealed it, set it by the door to go out with the next mail. She had no reason, on that January morning, to think that what was in the cellar would ever be anything other than enough. She went upstairs to check on the hem. The maple trees should have been running by the third week of March. Thomas knew this, the way he knew everything about this land, which was through his hands and his feet, and 20 years of watching the same fields go through the same changes in the same order. The maples ran when the days got above freezing and the nights stayed below. That particular back and forth of temperature that pulled the sap up through the wood like something waking after a long sleep. It happened every year. It had happened every year he had been on this land. He checked the tap he had set in the big maple at the east edge of the property on the morning of March 18th. The bucket beneath it was dry. He stood there for a moment, with his hand on the bark of the tree. The bark was cold, in the way bark was cold in February. Not in the way it was cold in March, when you could feel something different underneath. Some small warmth beginning. He could not feel anything different. The tree felt like it was still waiting. He picked up the empty bucket and walked back to the house. Ruth was at the table with her account book open when he came in. She looked at the bucket. He hung it on the peg by the door without speaking. She looked back at her account book. Still cold, he said. I know, she said. I felt it this morning. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. Outside the window, the fields were the gray-brown color of fields in early March. The snow mostly gone from the flat ground, but still sitting in the shadows along the fence lines and in the low places near the creek. The sky was the color of old pewter, flat and without depth, the kind of sky that did not commit to anything. It will warm up, he said. Ruth wrote something in the account book. Yes, she said. He drank his coffee and looked at the sky. He had seen late springs before. 1810 had been a late spring. 1812 had been cold through April, and then come on warm all at once in May, and the season had turned out fine. A late maple run did not mean anything by itself. It only meant the cold was holding on longer than usual, which happened, which was part of what Vermont was. He told himself this and went back out to check the cattle. Ruth waited until she heard the barn door close. Then she got up and went to the window and looked at the maple tree at the east edge of the property. The tap was still in it. The bucket was still hanging there. She looked at the tree for a while the way she sometimes looked at the numbers in her account book when they were not adding up the way she wanted them to add up. She went back to the table and opened the section of the account book where she kept the planting calendar. She had written the corn planting date as the 1st of May, which was when Thomas always planted, which was when his father had always planted, which was when the ground in Addison County was reliably warm enough to take seed and hold it. She looked at that date for a moment. Then she turned to the back of the book where she kept a separate page, one that Thomas had never asked about and that she had never shown him, where she wrote down things she was watching but not yet ready to name. She wrote the date and 3 words: Maples not running. She closed the book and put it in the drawer and started on the afternoon bread. May came home from school that afternoon with cold cheeks and the particular energy of a child who had been sitting still all day and was done with it. She dropped her coat on the floor, which she always did, and Ruth picked it up, which she always did, and May went to the window and looked out at the yard. It does not feel like spring, May said. It is only March, Ruth said. Last year, it felt like spring and March. Ruth put the coat on the hook. Some years are different. May pressed her nose against the cold glass. The Whitfield girls say their father says it is the coldest March in 10 years. Mr. Whitfield has been farming longer than most people in this county. Ruth said, if he says that, he is probably right. May turned from the window. Is that bad? Ruth looked at her daughter, 9 years old, with Thomas's dark eyes and a directness of gaze that sometimes caught Ruth off guard, even after 9 years of being looked at that way. No, Ruth said, it just means spring is taking its time. May accepted this the way she accepted most things Ruth told her, which was completely and without suspicion, because Ruth had not yet told her anything that turned out to be wrong. Ruth was aware of this. She was aware of it in a way that made her careful about what she said and how she said it. Because the day you were wrong was the day the whole foundation shifted. She was not wrong yet. Spring was taking its time. That was all it was. Eli came in after dark, having spent the afternoon helping Thomas with the fencing on the north side of the property, where 2 posts had heaved up over the winter and needed resetting. He was quiet at dinner, which was not unusual. He ate 2 bowls of soup and half a loaf of bread and went to his room after Thomas had fallen asleep. Ruth lay in the dark and listened to the house. The wind outside was from the north, which was wrong for late March. North wind in late March was a winter wind. It moved against the side of the house with a sound she associated with January, a low and steady push that found the gaps in the siding and made the lamp flames lean. She listened to it for a long time. She was not worried. There was nothing yet to be worried about. A late maple run and a cold March were not reasons to worry. They were reasons to watch. She was very good at watching. She closed her eyes and listened to the north wind and told herself that the cold was holding on, that it would break, that it always broke, that April would come and the ground would soften and the maples would run late, but they would run and the season would be what it had always been. She told herself this until she was almost asleep. Then she thought of one more thing and came fully awake again. She had left extra seed corn in the storage jar. Not much, just a small amount, separated from the main supply in September when she was putting things away for winter. She had not done this in any of the 9 previous years. She had done it this year without thinking about it much, the way you sometimes did things with your hands before your mind had caught up to why. She lay in the dark and thought about that jar of seed corn sitting on the cellar shelf. She did not go down and check it. There was no reason to check it. It was there. She had put it there herself. The wind shifted, just slightly, and for a moment it came from the west instead of the north. And she felt the difference, even through the walls of the house. A small change in quality, a small lessening of edge. She closed her eyes. March was almost done. April was coming. The jar of seed corn was in the cellar where she had put it. She slept. They put the seed in the ground on the 12th of May. Thomas had wanted to plant the first week of the month, the way his father had planted and his father's father before him, but the ground had not been ready. Ruth had simply gone out each morning and pressed her palm flat against the soil in the north field and come back in and made breakfast without comment. And Thomas had gone out and done the same thing and come back in and said that maybe they would wait a few more days. And this had continued until the 12th, when the ground finally gave under her hand with the particular softness that meant it was ready. "Today," she said at breakfast. Thomas looked up. "You are sure?" "Yes." He nodded and finished his coffee and went to get Eli. It was not warm. That was the first thing Ruth noticed when she stepped out to bring them water at mid-morning. The sky was clear, which was good, but the air had a quality to it she could not name exactly. A coolness that sat underneath the sunshine, the way cold water sat underneath the warmer surface layer of a lake. The sun was bright, but it did not feel the way May sunshine felt. It felt like April sunshine wearing May's clothes. She stood at the edge of the field and watched Thomas and Eli work the rows. Thomas moved the way he always moved when he was planting, steady and deliberate, making each hole with the same depth and spacing, settling each seed with the same pressure of his thumb. He had been doing this for 20 years. His body knew the work without being told. Eli was less steady. He kept stopping to look at the sky. She brought them the water and went back to the house. May was at the table doing her sums for school. Ruth sat down across from her and opened her account book and looked at the numbers she had been looking at for the past 2 weeks. The planting was 12 days later than usual. That meant the corn would come to tassel 12 days later than usual, which meant it would need the warm weather to hold 12 days later into August and September than it usually needed to hold. She had looked at the back pages of Thomas's grandfather's farm record, which Thomas kept on the shelf above the fireplace, and she had found 3 years in the last 50 where frost had come before the middle of September. She wrote nothing in the account book. She closed it. "Mama," May said, without looking up from her sums. "Yes." "Why does Eli keep looking at the sky?" Ruth looked at her daughter. "Does he?" "He does it when he thinks no one is watching." May erased something on her slate. "I think something is bothering him." Ruth went to the window. She could see the two of them in the north field, Thomas ahead and Eli following. Even from here she could see the difference in how they carried themselves. Thomas bent and straightened with the rhythm of someone doing a thing he had done 1,000 times. Eli moved the same way for a while, and then he would stop and stand straight and look up. "He is just thinking," Ruth said. "About what?" "Things boys think about." May made a sound that meant she found this answer unsatisfactory. Ruth did not offer a better one. She watched Eli stop again and look up at the sky. The sky was clear and blue and unremarkable. She looked at it herself, trying to see what he was seeing. She told herself she was tired. She had slept poorly. The sun was exactly where it should be. At noon, she brought them cornbread and water, and they sat at the edge of the field and ate. The soil around them was dark and turned, the rows running straight back toward the tree line. Thomas ate with the satisfaction of a man who has gotten the seed in the ground. The moment in a farmer's year when you could feel good about where things stood, when the future was still all possibility, and none of what could go wrong had gone wrong yet. "Good rows," he said. Eli ate his cornbread and did not say anything. "The ground took the seed well," Thomas said. "It was ready." It was ready. Ruth agreed. They sat for a while in the thin May sunshine. A crow flew over the far end of the field, making its sound. The trees at the edge of the property were fully leafed now. Finally, the green a little darker than usual, because the leaves had come out late and quickly, and not gone through the slow opening that usually made the early leaf color so pale. "What do you think?" Thomas asked. He was looking at the rows of turned earth, the seed invisible beneath it. "I think we put the seed in," Ruth said. He looked at her. "That is not what I asked." She looked back at him. "I know." He waited. She let him wait for a moment. "I think the seed is in the ground," she said finally. "And now we see what the ground and the sky decide to do with it." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked back at the field. "It will be fine," he said. But he said it in the tone of a man saying something he needed to hear said, not in the tone of a man reporting a fact. Ruth handed Eli the last piece of cornbread. He took it and ate it and looked at the sky again. "What do you see up there?" she asked him. He looked at her, surprised. "Nothing," he said. "Then why do you keep looking?" He thought about this for a moment. "Because it does not look right," he said. "I do not know how to say what is wrong with it. It just does not look right to me." Thomas made a sound that was not quite dismissive. "It is a clear sky." "Yes," Eli said. "I know." They finished eating. Thomas stood and went back to the rows. Eli followed. Ruth stayed a moment longer at the edge of the field, sitting with the empty water pail, looking up at the sky that was clear and blue, and by every measure she knew exactly what a May sky in Vermont was supposed to be. She looked at it the way Eli had been looking at it. She did not see anything wrong with it. She picked up the pail and went back to the house. That night she went to the cellar before bed. She held the lamp up and looked at the jar of seed corn on the back shelf. The jar she had set aside in September. The extra amount. The thing her hands had done before her mind caught up to why. She moved it from the back shelf to the front, where she could see it without looking for it. And she went back upstairs and blew out the lamp and lay down next to Thomas, who was already asleep, outside. The May night was quiet and cold and clear, and somewhere in the north field the seed corn lay in the dark soil, waiting for a warmth that was so far, taking longer than it should to arrive. May saw it first. She came down the stairs in the gray early light before anyone else was in the kitchen, the way she sometimes did when something woke her and she could not get back to sleep. And she went to the window the way children went to windows in the morning, without a reason, just to see what the world looked like. She stood there for a moment. Then she went back to the stairs and called up, "Mama." Ruth was already half awake. She had been half awake since some time before dawn, lying in the particular stillness that meant her body knew something her mind had not caught up to yet. She heard May's voice and got up without waking Thomas and came to the top of the stairs. "Come and look," May said. Ruth came down. She crossed the kitchen in her bare feet and stood beside her daughter at the window and looked out at the yard and the garden and the fence rails and the roof of the hen house and the north field beyond. Snow, not a storm, not the heavy dark sky of a real snowstorm, just a thin white layer, an inch, maybe less, lying on every flat surface the same way frost lay on things, except that it was not frost. It was snow. It was the 6th of June, and there was snow on the fence rails, and snow on the roof of the hen house, and snow on the garden where the onion shoots had been coming up for 3 weeks. and beyond the garden. Snow on the north field where the corn had been in the ground for 25 days and had been up for 12 of them. 6 inches of young green corn standing in rows that were now white. Ruth looked at it. She did not say anything. She stood at the window with her bare feet on the cold kitchen floor and looked at the snow on the 6th of June in the year 1816, and she did not say anything at all. "Mama," May said. "Yes." "Is that snow?" "Yes." May looked at the field. "On the corn." "Yes." May was quiet for a moment. She was 9 years old, and she understood what corn was for. She had been in this house through 9 harvests and 9 winters, and she understood, in the way children understood things they had grown up around, what it meant when the corn was growing, and what it meant when the corn was not. She did not understand yet what snow in June meant, but she understood from the way her mother was standing that it meant something. "Will it be all right?" May asked. Ruth put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Go put your shoes on," she said. "The floor is cold." May went upstairs. Ruth stayed at the window. She was still standing there when she heard Thomas get up. She heard his feet on the floor above, heard him go to the window in their room, heard him stop. A long silence. Then his feet on the stairs, faster than usual, and he came through the kitchen without his coat and went straight out the back door into the June morning that should not have had snow in it, and did. Ruth watched him through the window. He walked to the edge of the garden and stopped. He looked at the onion shoots, bent under the thin white weight. He kept walking. He went out through the garden gate and across the path to the north field, and he stood at the edge of the corn rows and looked down the length of them. She could not see his face from where she stood. She did not need to. The snow lay on the corn leaves the way snow lay on things that were not meant to hold snow, lightly and without mercy. The white of it against the green of the young stalks, so wrong as a color combination that her eyes kept trying to correct it and could not. Eli came down and saw her at the window and looked out and said nothing. He went and got his coat from the peg and went outside. Ruth watched him walk out to where Thomas was standing, at the edge of the corn rows. Eli stopped beside his father. The two of them stood there together, not speaking, looking at the corn. After a while, Eli bent down and took hold of one of the stalks near the base and lifted it slightly, the way you lifted something to check what was underneath. He held it for a moment. Then he let it go and stood back up. Ruth knew what he had felt. She knew it without going out there. The stalk had been firm at the base, which might mean something, and the leaves had been soft in the way leaves got when the cold had already gotten into them, which meant what it meant. She had seen it before. Once, a late frost in May, when she was a girl on her father's farm in New Hampshire. The way the leaves of young plants went soft and translucent when the cold had broken the cells inside them. The way they looked as though they were simply tired and would recover, and then over the course of the morning did not recover. May came back downstairs with her shoes on and her coat over her nightgown. "Can I go out?" she asked. "Stay on the path," Ruth said. May went out. Ruth watched her cross the yard to where Thomas and Eli were standing. May looked at the corn for a moment. Then she looked up at her father. "Papa," she said. Thomas looked down at her. "Did summer come yet?" she asked. Thomas looked back at the field. Ruth saw his shoulders move, a single slow breath going out of him. "Yes," he said. "Summer came." May looked at the snow on the corn. She did not say anything else. She was working something out in her mind, something that did not quite fit together. And Ruth knew the feeling because she was working out the same thing. The snow began to melt as the morning came on. By 10 o'clock it was gone from the garden and the fence rails and the henhouse roof. The ground dark and wet where it had been. The onion shoots standing back up slowly, like people who had been knocked down and were deciding whether they were hurt. By noon, the yard looked almost like June. But the corn in the north field did not look like June. The corn in the north field looked like something that had been through something. Ruth spent the morning in the kitchen doing the bread and the cleaning and the mending that needed doing. The ordinary work of an ordinary morning, because the ordinary work still needed doing regardless of what the morning had been. She heard Thomas and Eli come in for the midday meal and go back out without much conversation. She heard May in the yard talking to the hens. In the early afternoon, she went out to the field herself. She walked the rows the way Thomas had walked them. She did not bend down and lift the stalks the way Eli had. She just walked and looked. The snow was gone, but the evidence of it was not. The leaves of the upper stalks had that translucent look she remembered from her father's farm. Pale where they had been bright, soft where they had been stiff. The lower leaves, closer to the ground, were still green and firm. The stalks themselves, when she put her hand flat against them, were cool and yielding in a way that good corn in June should not be. She walked the length of the north field and back. She did the arithmetic of it in her head as she walked. 25 days in the ground, 12 days up. If they replanted today, they would be looking at germination in another 10 days, emergence in another 7, which would put new growth into the ground the 3rd week of June. Corn needed roughly 90 days of warm growing weather from emergence to harvest. The 3rd week of June plus 90 days put harvest in the 3rd week of September. The average date of first hard frost in Addison County was the 28th of September. 7 days. 7 days between the corn being ready and the frost coming. Assuming a normal summer from here. Assuming no more cold. Assuming the warmth that had not come in May and had not come enough in June would arrive and stay. She walked back to the house. Thomas was sitting on the back step. He looked up when she came through the gate. The lower stalks might come back, he said. Some of them, yes, she said. The upper leaves are gone. Yes. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had been farming since he was Eli's age. Rough across the knuckles. The nails always with soil under them no matter how he washed. He turned them over and looked at the palms. We replant, he said. Ruth sat down on the step beside him. We have enough seed, she said. For one field. He looked up. One. The jar I set back in September. Enough for the north field. Not enough for both. He was quiet. He understood what she was telling him without her having to say it in full, which was that she had known in September that this was possible, that she had prepared for it without telling him, and that the preparation was the only reason they had a choice to make right now, rather than simply a loss to absorb. Northfield, he said. Northfield gets more sun in August, she said. Better chance. He nodded. He looked back at the field. The wet rows of damaged corn caught the afternoon light and gave it back dull where it should have been bright. All right, he said. He stood up and went to get Eli. Ruth stayed on the step. She sat there alone for a while, with the afternoon coming on around her, and the birds in the trees at the field's edge, making their ordinary sounds, and the smell of the wet ground after the snow rising up, the way it always rose after rain, which was a good smell, a smell that meant growing weather, a smell that had always meant that before, and that she was not sure she trusted anymore. She went inside and down to the cellar and moved the seed corn jar from the shelf to the table by the stairs, where Thomas would be able to find it in the morning. And she went back up and started supper. And she did not say to anyone what she had calculated in the field, which was 7 days. Because 7 days was the kind of number that did not help anyone get through a June evening. It was the 6th of June, 1816. The snow was gone. The damage was not. They put the second seed in on the 14th of June, 8 days after the snow. 8 days of Thomas and Eli pulling out the damaged stalks from the north field, working from the east end to the west, piling the dead corn at the edge of the tree line where it lay in a heap that Ruth could see from the kitchen window and chose, most of the time, not to look at. The lower stalks had not come back the way Thomas had hoped. A few of them had put out a small new leaf at the base, pale and tentative. But by the 4th day, it was clear these would not amount to anything. The south field they left as it was. The corn there damaged the same way. The decision made by arithmetic, and not discussed at length. They had 1 jar of seed. 1 field was what 1 jar would plant. The north field got more sun in August. On the morning of the 14th, Ruth came out to the north field after breakfast and watched Thomas and Eli make the first rows of the second planting. She had brought the jar of seed corn from the cellar, and she stood at the end of the first row and held it while Thomas worked back toward her. When he reached her end, he held out his hand and she poured seed into it. The right amount? The amount she had calculated the night before, based on the row length and the spacing, and he went back down the row with it. They did not talk much. The decision to replant was not a decision that required conversation. It was the only thing to do. So they were doing it. Eli worked the parallel row without being told what to do. He had watched his father plant enough times that his hands knew the work, the spacing of the holes, the depth, the firm press of soil over each seed. He worked steadily and without looking up, which was how Eli worked when he was thinking. And Ruth could tell from his silence that whatever he was thinking was not about the planting. At mid-morning she walked to the village to Greer's store. She had a short list of things they needed. She also had a longer list in her head of things she wanted to know. Amos Greer had been in Addison County since before it was a county and knew the price of everything within 50 miles and the state of everyone's farm within 20. He was not a gossip. He was a man who understood that information was a practical matter and should be treated as such. She bought her salt and her lamp oil. While he was adding up the prices, she said, without particular emphasis, "How is the flour holding?" He looked at her over the counter. Holding. Price. He named a number. She kept her face where it was. The number was 15% higher than it had been in March. Corn, she asked. Higher than flour, he said. She nodded and folded her list and put it in her pocket. Whitfield was in yesterday, Greer said, in the tone of a man mentioning something he thought she might want to know. Says his north field is the same as everybody else's. I heard his fields were bad. Ruth said, bad enough. Greer wrapped her salt in brown paper. He is putting in oats on the south piece? Late planting, but oats come faster. Ruth thought about this. Oats came faster, and they were hardier, and they did not need the same length of warm weather that corn needed. She had planted extra oats in the kitchen garden already. She had not suggested it to Thomas for the south field, because Thomas had 30 years of corn in his hands, and the south field had always been corn, and she had not thought the conversation was one she could have yet. She thought about it now. Whitfield is a sensible man, she said. He is, Greer said. She paid for her things and walked home. She went through the south field on her way back from the lane. The dead corn stood in its rows. Dry now. The stalks a pale brown. The leaves papery and loose, moving slightly in a wind that should have been warm and was not warm enough. She walked one row from end to end. The soil between the stalks was good soil, dark and loose from the spring turning. The kind of soil that would take seed if seed was put into it. She went to the barn and found Thomas checking the harness. "I want to talk to you about the south field," she said. He looked up. "Oats," she said. "Something that comes faster." He set down the harness. He did not say anything right away, which meant he was thinking about it, which meant he had probably already been thinking about it and had not known how to bring it up. "Oats," he said finally. "Greer says Whitfield is putting in oats on his south piece." Thomas picked the harness back up. "We would need seed." "I know what we would need," Ruth said. "I am asking if you want to do it." He was quiet for a moment. "How much do we have?" She had been waiting for this question for 3 weeks. She had known it was coming, and she had known she was the one who would have to answer it. And she had thought about how to answer it in a way that was honest and did not break something that did not need to be broken yet. "Enough for summer," she said. "If the corn comes in on the north field, enough for winter. And if the corn does not come in," she met his eyes, "then we will have a different conversation in September." He looked at her for a long moment. Thomas was not a man who looked away from things, even things he did not want to look at. And she had always respected this about him, even when it made certain moments harder. "All right," he said. "Oats on the south field?" She went back to Greer's the next morning and bought the oat seed and came home and told Eli, who took the oat seed in a shoulder sack and went out to the south field and broadcast it by hand across the stubble, walking the rows in long, even arcs, the way his grandfather had taught Thomas, and Thomas had taught him, then harrowed it in behind the horse. Ruth stood at the kitchen window and watched him work across the field in the afternoon light. The old motion of a man planting by hand in the ancient way. The seed going into the ground, one handful at a time. It was a different kind of planting than the corn planting. The corn planting had been the ordinary planting, the one they did every year, the one that was supposed to happen. This planting was the answer to a question they had not wanted to ask. May came and stood beside her at the window. "What are they planting?" May asked. "Oats," Ruth said. "We always plant corn in the south field. This year we are planting oats." May looked at the field, looked at her mother. "Because of the snow?" "Yes," Ruth said. "Because of the snow." May turned back to the window. She watched her brother work the field in the afternoon light. After a while she said, "Will the oats be all right?" "Oats are tough," Ruth said. "Tougher than corn?" "Yes." May considered this. "Then maybe we should plant oats every year. Ruth almost smiled. Maybe, she said. She went back to the bread she had been making. Through the window she could see Eli finishing the last pass of the south field. The afternoon light coming over the tree line at a low angle. That particular light that had been wrong all spring and summer. Not dim exactly, but without the full weight of June sunshine, as though something was standing between them and the sun and diffusing it before it arrived. She had noticed this light every day since April. She had written nothing about it in the back pages of her account book, because she did not have a word for it, and she did not want to write things she did not have words for. She shaped the bread loaves and set them to rise. Outside, in the north field, the second planting of corn lay in the ground in the dark. Waiting, in the south field, the oat seed lay in the turned earth. Also waiting, two different bets on the same summer, placed with what they had left. The light came through the kitchen window at its wrong angle, and lay across the table in a color that was almost right and not quite right, and that Ruth had stopped trying to name. She covered the bread and went to start supper. The corn came up on the 23rd of June. Ruth saw it first. The way she saw most things on this farm first, which was because she was up before anyone else, and because she made a point of looking. She had gone out to the north field in the early morning, while the dew was still on everything, and she had walked the first row, and there they were, the small paired leaves of new corn pushing up through the soil, pale green and slightly translucent in the morning light, fragile in the way that new things were fragile, and strong in the way that living things pushing through soil were strong. She stood there for a moment with the dew on her boots and looked at them. She did not go wake Thomas. She let him find them himself, which he did 2 hours later. And she heard him call out to Eli from the field. A short sound, not quite a word, that carried back to the house in a way that told her everything she needed to know about what he was feeling. July came in warmer than June had been, and the relief of it moved through the farm the way warmth itself moved. Slowly, and then, all at once, Thomas came to the table with something loosened in his face that had been tight since early spring. Eli went back to his school book in the evenings, which he had not done in weeks. May started going barefoot again, which she had stopped in the cold June, and the sound of her bare feet on the kitchen floor was a sound Ruth had not realized she had missed until she heard it again. The corn grew. It grew the way corn grew when it had finally found the warmth it needed. Visibly, almost daily. The kind of growth you could mark with your eye from one morning to the next. Thomas measured it against the fence post at the end of the first row each week, scratching a mark with his thumbnail. By the second week of July, it was knee-high. By the third week, it was above the knee. He came in from checking it on a Wednesday evening in the middle of the month and sat down at the table and said that it was looking good. "It is looking good," he said, and the way he said it was the way a man said something he had been afraid to say for a long time and was only now allowing himself. Ruth said yes. It was. She meant it. The corn looked good. The oats in the south field looked better than good. The kitchen garden was producing. The hay in the east meadow was coming up thicker than last year. These were real things, measurable things, and she measured them, and they were true. But the light was still wrong. She noticed it every afternoon. The particular quality of the July sunshine, that should have been the strongest sunshine of the year and was instead something less than that. Something filtered. The shadows it made on the ground, not quite as sharp as they should have been. The warmth it carried, real, but not as deep as July warmth usually went. She had lived in Vermont for 38 years. She knew what July felt like on her skin. This July felt like a good day in early September. She said nothing about this to Thomas. The sunsets were the other thing. They had been wrong since May. But in July they became impossible to ignore. The orange in them was a color she did not have a word for. A saturated deep orange that seemed to come from below the horizon rather than above it, spreading up into the sky and staying there long after the sun was down, staining the western sky for an hour or more after dark should have come. Twice in September she had gone to the window thinking the barn was on fire and found it was only the sky. In July the color started earlier and burned longer, and she stood at the kitchen window some evenings and watched it the way you watch something that was beautiful in a way that made you uneasy. May stood beside her one evening and said it was the most beautiful sky she had ever seen. Ruth said yes. It was something. May said, "Why was the sky that color?" Ruth said she did not know. May looked at her. "You always know things." "Not this one," Ruth said. May turned back to the window. The sky went on burning its wrong orange above the tree line, wide and deep and completely without explanation. She went to the village on a Tuesday in the middle of the month for flour and thread, and she stopped to talk to Patience Wheeler, who lived on the hill road above the village and whose husband had died in the spring, leaving her to manage the farm alone with her 2 grown sons. Patience was a practical woman who did not talk about things without reason. Patience said the hay was coming in short. Ruth said yes. She had noticed that. Patience said she was worried about getting enough hay up for winter. Ruth said she understood the concern. Patience said, and here she lowered her voice, not because anyone was near, but because it was the kind of thing you lowered your voice to say, that she had heard from her cousin in Stratford that the whole northeast of the county had the same report. Hay running short. The grass not getting the height it should in July. Ruth walked home thinking about hay. Hay was what the cattle ate in winter. Hay was what stood between a farm's animals and starvation between December and April. If the hay came in short this summer, a farmer had 2 choices: buy hay at prices that were already rising, or reduce the number of animals that needed feeding. She had already been thinking about this. She had not yet put it in the account book because putting it in the account book made it a plan, and she was not ready to make it a plan. She put it in the account book that night. She wrote in the column she kept for livestock hay estimate, short by 1/3, possibly more. Below that, she wrote options. Below that, she wrote 2 things and looked at them for a while and closed the book. Thomas came to bed late that night. She heard him at the window before he lay down. The particular pause of a man looking at the sky. That color again, he said, more to himself than to her. Yes, she said. He lay down. They were quiet for a while. Hay is short, she said. I know, he said. Patience Wheeler is worried. Whitfield is worried too. He said so at the mill last week. Ruth was quiet for a moment. We may need to make some decisions about the cattle. Thomas was quiet. Then, not yet. No, she said. Not yet. They lay in the dark without speaking. Outside the window, the July night was quiet. The insects making their sounds. The creek in the distance. It was warmer than the days in June had been. Genuinely warm. And she was grateful for that. Genuinely grateful. Because the corn was growing, and the oats were growing, and Thomas had something loose in his face again, and May was running barefoot in the yard. She was grateful for all of it. She just could not make herself stop counting. It was what she did. It was what she had always done. She counted and measured and kept the account and watched the numbers. And right now, the numbers were better than they had been in June, but they were not where they needed to be. And the margin between where they were and where they needed to be was a margin that depended entirely on August being warm and September being warm, and the first frost holding off until the very end of the month. 7 days. She had calculated in June. 7 days between when the corn would be ready and when the frost would come. On an average year, this was not an average year. She closed her eyes and listened to the insects and the creek and Thomas breathing beside her. Slower now, moving toward sleep. She thought about Eli. He had been different in July. Slightly. In a way she could not entirely name. He had done his work. All of it. Without complaint and without needing to be asked. He had been kind to May. He had been careful with Thomas in a way that had a quality of deliberateness to it. As though he was paying attention to something he had not paid attention to before. The newspaper notice about Ohio was still on the shelf by the window. She had seen him look at it twice in July. Both times, he had looked at it, and then looked out the window at the fields, and then gone back to what he was doing. She did not know what that meant. She thought she might know. She did not want to know yet. She slept. August was coming. The corn was growing. 7 days was the margin between what they needed and what they had. And right now, in the middle of a July that was warmer than June had been, and not as warm as it should have been, 7 days felt like enough. Above the Vermont sky, invisible, a thin veil of sulfate particles that had been traveling since the spring of 1815 continued its slow work, scattering just enough sunlight back into space to keep the warmth below from being what the season required. No one in Addison County could see it. No one in Addison County had a word for it. The sky went on burning its deep orange at dusk. The corn went on growing. The 7 days held, for now, like a breath not yet let out. Thomas woke at 2 in the morning and lay still. He did not know what had woken him. The house was quiet. Ruth was asleep beside him. Through the window the sky was clear and deep. The stars very bright the way they were on cold, clear nights. The sky washed clean of any haze. The moon was down. He lay there for a moment thinking about why a clear night in August would wake him. Then he knew. He got up without lighting the lamp and went to the window. He had bought the thermometer from a peddler 3 winters ago. A glass tube in a wooden frame that he had mounted on the outside of the windowsill. And he had come to trust it the way he trusted his own hands for most things, and more than his own hands for this one thing specifically. Because he had found over the years that a man could talk himself into believing the night was warmer than it was if he needed it to be warmer. He trusted the numbers more than he trusted his own comfort. He held the lamp close to the glass. 34 degrees. He stood there with the lamp in his hand. 34 degrees was 2 degrees above freezing. 2 degrees was not nothing. 2 degrees was the difference between a cold night in August, unusual and unsettling, but survivable, and a killing frost on the corn that was 8 weeks in the ground and not yet ready to harvest. 2 degrees. He looked at the clear sky. Clear sky in August meant no cloud cover. And no cloud cover meant the temperature would keep dropping until dawn. He looked at the thermometer again, as if looking at it a second time would change what it said. 34 degrees. He stood at the window for a long time. The farm was quiet below him. The barn roof dark. The fields invisible in the darkness. The corn in the north field out there somewhere in the night. Tasseling now. Doing the final and most important work of the whole season. Work that required temperatures above freezing to complete. He made a calculation. 2 degrees. On a clear night, with the wind down, the temperature could drop 2 more degrees by dawn. Or it could hold where it was. Or it could even come back up slightly toward morning if a thin cloud moved in. He had seen all 3 happen. He could not know which this night would choose. He looked at the thermometer one more time. Then he went back to bed. Ruth was awake. She had been awake since he got up. She lay still with her eyes open in the dark and did not ask him what he had seen because she already knew from the way he came back to bed. The specific weight of how he lay down. That the number he had seen was a number that was not safe and was not dangerous enough to do anything about at 2 in the morning. She lay beside him in the dark and listened to him not sleep. She did not sleep either. At 5 she got up and dressed and went downstairs. She built the fire and put the kettle on, and then she went out the back door into the August morning. The frost was on everything, not heavy, a light frost, the kind that silvered the grass and the top rails of the fence and the roof of the hen house with a thin, cold brightness that caught the first gray light of dawn and gave it back doubled. She walked to the garden first. The bean plants had a white edge on every leaf. The pumpkin vines were still. She touched a pumpkin leaf, and it was stiff under her fingers in the way she knew. She walked to the north field. She walked to the end of the first row and looked down the length of it. The tassels of the corn caught the frost the way tassels caught everything, holding it in the fine threads, the white of it visible even in the early light. She walked into the row. She put her hand on a stalk, then on the leaves below the tassel, then on the ear that was forming in its husk halfway up the stalk. The husk was cold and wet. She peeled back a corner of it with her thumb. Inside, the silk was dark. Dark silk on a forming ear in August meant the frost had gotten to it. She moved to the next stalk. The same, the next, the same. She walked 6 rows deep into the field before she found a stalk where the silk was still pale. And even there, it was at the bottom of the ear, the part most protected by the husk, and she did not allow herself to feel anything about finding it. She walked back to the end of the first row and stood there. The sun was coming up now, just the edge of it over the tree line to the east, and in its light, the frost on the corn was bright and precise, each crystal catching the light separately, the whole field glittering in a way that would have been beautiful if it had been January when it was supposed to be there. Thomas came out of the house. He crossed the yard without looking at her, went through the garden gate, came to the field. He stopped at the row beside her. He looked at the frost on the tassels. He put his hand on the nearest stalk the way she had put her hand on it. He peeled back the corner of the husk. He looked at the dark silk inside. He did not say anything. He walked into the field. She watched him go, moving from stalk to stalk, doing what she had done, checking the silk on each ear. He went further in than she had gone. She watched him move between the rows, bending and checking, bending and checking, and she could tell from the way he moved, from the increasing slowness of it, what he was finding. He came back to where she was standing. They stood side by side at the end of the row and looked at the field. Thermometer said 34 at 2. He said, "I know." She said, "I heard you get up. I thought 2 degrees was enough." She did not say anything to that. "I should have come back out," he said. "You could not have done anything," she said. "There was nothing to do at 2 in the morning except watch it happen." He looked at the field. The sun was fully up now, and the frost was melting off the upper leaves of the corn, the brightness going out of it as the ice became water, and the water ran down the stalks in small, thin lines. The field looked, for a moment, almost all right. Water on corn in August was not the worst thing. It was the corn itself that was the problem. The silk on the ears, the work inside the husk that had been interrupted. "How much?" he said. She had been calculating since she came out to the field. She gave him the number. He was quiet for a long time. "The oats?" he said. "The oats are better," she said. "Oats handle cold better. We will not know until we look, but I think the oats are better." He nodded. He did not move to go look at the oats. He stood with the corn. Eli came out of the house. He crossed the yard and came to the field and stood on the other side of Thomas and looked at what they were looking at. He did not ask questions. He was 16 years old, and he had been on this farm his whole life, and he knew what frost on corn tassels in August meant. Without anyone telling him, the 3 of them stood at the end of the row in the August morning. After a while, May came to the back door in her nightgown and looked out at them standing in the field, and Ruth saw her there and raised her hand, and May raised hers back and went inside. "I need to know," Thomas said. He said it quietly, the way he said things when he was saying them to himself as much as to her. "I need to know what we have." "I know," Ruth said. "After breakfast," he said. "After breakfast," she said. They went inside. Ruth made the oatmeal and the bread and the coffee and put them on the table and called Eli, and they sat down and ate. Nobody talked. May ate her oatmeal and looked at the faces around her and did not ask the questions Ruth could see she was holding back, which was a mercy that Ruth filed away to be grateful for later. After breakfast, Eli went out to look at the oats. Thomas sat at the table. Ruth went to the drawer and took out the account book and opened it to the current page and set it on the table between them. She sat down across from him. She told him the numbers. Not quickly, not slowly, just the numbers, one after another, the way she had always given him numbers, without apology and without softening. The corn from the north field, what they could expect given what she had seen this morning. The oats from the south field, the better estimate, the hay, the short hay, the amount they had stored and the amount they needed, the flour in the bin and what it would last, the salt pork in the barrels and how far it would go. She told him all of it. He sat with his coffee in both hands and listened without interrupting. When she was done, he looked at the account book for a moment, at the numbers written in her careful hand. The columns she had kept through 9 years of marriage. Every year's harvest and every year's winter written down in this book. He set the coffee down. February, he said. If we are careful, Ruth said. Yes, and after February, she met his eyes. That is what we need to decide. Eli came back in. He stood in the doorway, still in his coat. He had heard the last part. Ruth could tell from his face that he had heard it and that he understood it. Oats look all right, he said. Cold got the top leaves. The grain is still forming. I think we are going to get most of it. Thomas nodded. Good, he said. But he said it the way you said a word, when the word was too small for what you meant. Ruth closed the account book. Outside, the August sun was burning the last of the frost off the north field. The corn standing in its rows, with a damage inside it that the sunshine could not fix, looking from a distance like a crop that might still be all right. Looking from the end of the row, up close, like what it was. The coffee on the table went cold. Nobody reached for it. The account book sat closed between them on the table. February, Ruth had said. After February was the question that was now in the room with them and was not going to leave. The scale was the first thing she brought up from the cellar. It was a small balance scale. 2 shallow tin pans hanging from a wooden crossbeam on a hook, worn smooth on the crossbeam, where hands had lifted it and set it down 10,000 times. Ruth had never thought much about it before. It had always been there, doing what it did, measuring out what needed to be measured. She had never needed to think about it. She set it on the kitchen table on the morning of August 22nd, 2 days after the frost, and she did not put it away again until November. The first thing she weighed was the cornmeal. She poured it from the damaged corn into the bin by careful measurement, knowing now exactly what they had, writing the number in the account book, and then doing the division she had been doing in her head for 2 days, which was how much they could use each week between now and February, and have it come out to something rather than nothing. She wrote the weekly number on a slip of paper and tucked it inside the account book cover. After that, she weighed everything. She was not a woman who did things obsessively. She was a woman who did things completely, which was a different quality. And the difference was that completeness had a purpose and knew when to stop. She weighed the dried beans and the rye flour and the small amount of wheat flour she had bought from Greer in July. She counted the crocks of pickled vegetables on the cellar shelves and wrote each one down. She counted the crocks of salt pork. She counted the dried herbs hanging from the kitchen rafters and assessed which ones were food and which ones were medicine. Because in a winter like the one coming, those were 2 different categories. She did all of this between the hours of 5 and 7 in the morning, before the household was awake, because these were her hours and this was her work, and she had always done her deepest thinking in the early morning when the house was quiet, and the only sound was the fire she had built and the first birds outside. Patience Wheeler came on a Thursday. She came across the fields the way neighbors came when they did not want to be seen coming down the road, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth and wearing her everyday dress and the particular expression of a woman who had something to say and had decided to say it. Ruth saw her coming from the kitchen window and put the kettle on. They sat at the kitchen table with their tea, and for a while they talked about ordinary things. The weather, the Wheeler boys, the state of the road to the village after the rains. Then Patience set her cup down and put her hands flat on the table. "I came to show you something," she said. She unwrapped the cloth bundle. Inside was a small earthenware pot sealed with a layer of rendered fat, and beside it a piece of folded paper with writing on it. Small and neat. "My mother's method for putting up beans without brine," Patience said. "You pack them in lard instead. They keep longer, and they do not go soft the way brined beans go soft." Ruth looked at the pot. She picked it up and turned it in her hands. "How long do they keep?" "My mother said a year. I have kept them 8 months myself, and they were good." Ruth set the pot down and unfolded the paper. The method was written in an older hand, faded but legible. Directions for cleaning and packing and sealing that were different from what Ruth did. Simpler in some ways and more careful in others. She read it twice. "May I copy this?" she said. "I brought it for you to copy," Patience said. Ruth got her pen and her ink and copied the method into the back of the account book, the page where she kept things she was watching but not yet ready to name. She copied it word for word, the old handwriting becoming her own handwriting, the knowledge passing between them, the way knowledge had always passed between women in this county, hand to hand across a kitchen table. After Patience left, Ruth went to the cellar and looked at her bean supply. She had dried beans, and she had brined beans. She had enough lard. She spent the afternoon putting up 2 crocks of beans using Patience's mother's method, packing them tight and sealing the fat smooth across the top and writing the date on the side of each crock with a bit of chalk. She put them on the lowest shelf, behind the other things, where they would be coldest. She worked like this every day. The mornings were for calculating and planning, and the afternoons were for the physical work of it. The work of her hands. That would be the difference between February being the end of their food supply and February being a difficult month that they got through. She picked the last of the kitchen garden before the next cold spell could take it. Everything. The small pumpkins that were not fully ripe, and the last of the green beans, and the beets that she dug with her hands when the fork was too slow. She spread the pumpkins along the south wall of the cellar, where they would get whatever warmth came through the foundation stones. She smoked the 2 smaller of the 6 hens that Thomas had agreed they could not afford to feed through winter. She did it herself. On a morning when May was at school and Thomas and Eli were in the east meadow cutting the last of the hay, she did it quickly and without sentiment, because sentiment was not something she could afford. In August of 1816, and she hung the smoked birds from the cellar ceiling where they would keep until they were needed. She did not tell May about the hens. May would have named them. She had probably already named them. In the evenings, she mended. Everything that could be mended, she mended. Because a torn coat in January was a coat that let in cold, and cold in January was a cost they could not pay. She went through the children's winter things first, and then Thomas's, and then her own, sitting by the fire with her needle and her small lamp, the house quiet around her, everyone else in bed. She was sitting like this on a Thursday evening in early September when Eli came downstairs. He came down in his stocking feet, without a reason. I just found himself doing it the way you found yourself doing things, when you had been lying in the dark thinking for too long. He sat down across from her at the table. She kept mending. She did not ask him what he wanted. With Eli you waited. He watched her work for a while. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "Did you know in June that it was going to be this bad?" She looked up from the mending. He was watching her with the directness he had gotten from her side of the family. That quality of looking that expected an honest answer and would know if it did not get one. "I did not know," she said. "I thought it was possible." "Is that why you put the seed corn back in September?" "Last year." She looked at him. "Yes." He was quiet. "So you were thinking about it before any of it happened?" "I was watching," she said. "There is a difference." He thought about this. "What were you watching?" She set the mending down. The maple run was late. The ground stayed cold longer than it should. The light in May was not right. She paused. None of those things by themselves meant anything. Together they meant something might be coming that we had not seen before. "But you did not tell Father?" "No." "Why?" She picked up the mending again. "Because I did not know. I only thought something was possible. If I had told your father everything I thought was possible, every spring for 20 years, we would have spent 20 years afraid of things that mostly did not happen." Eli looked at his hands on the table. His father's hands. "But this one did happen." "Yes," she said. "This one did." He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Outside, the September night was cold in the way September was cold. The honest cold of a season ending. Not the wrong cold of a season refusing to begin. "I have been thinking about Ohio," he said. Ruth kept her eyes on the mending. "I know," she said. "Jacob Whitfield is going in April." "I know that too." Silence. "Then do you think I should go?" She set the mending down and looked at her son. 16 years old, with his father's hands and her eyes, and 20 years of Vermont in his body, and something else in him that Vermont was not going to be able to hold much longer. Something that was not dissatisfaction exactly, but was closer to appetite. The appetite of a person who understood that what was in front of him was not all there was. "I think," she said carefully, "that this farm cannot support 2 families. Not this farm as it is now." He looked at her. "That is not an answer." "It is the only honest answer I have," she said. "Everything else is yours to decide." He sat with that. She picked up the mending again. The needle went in and out of the cloth. Small and regular. The thread pulling tight. After a while he went back upstairs. She sat alone with the fire and the mending and the September night outside. She thought about her mother's kitchen in New Hampshire, where she had sat at this same hour on similar evenings, watching her mother do this same work. The needle and the thread and the fire and the quiet house. Her mother had mended everything. Nothing in that house was thrown away until it had been repaired beyond the point where repairing it made sense. That was the practice of women who understood scarcity, who had learned it not because anyone told them to, but because it was in the air of the houses they grew up in, passed along without words. She was passing it along now. She did not know if Eli saw it. She thought May did, in the way May saw everything, quietly and from the side. The fire needed a log. She put one on and went back to her chair. The account book was on the shelf above the table. She did not take it down. She knew what was in it. They were going to be short. They were going to be short by enough to matter, and not enough to be certain. Which was the worst kind of short, because it was the kind that still required decisions. She finished the cuff she was mending and folded it and set it aside and started on a tear in the knee of Eli's winter trousers. The ones he would need in December. The ones he might not be here to wear. She mended them anyway. Whatever Eli decided, the trousers needed mending. She worked until the fire burned low, and then she banked it for the night and went upstairs. And the kitchen was quiet behind her, with the mended things folded on the chair, and the account book on the shelf, and the scale on the table, still there, the 2 tin pans hanging level in the dark. They cut the oats on the 6th of September. Thomas and Eli were out before first light. Ruth could hear them moving in the barn below in the dark. The particular sounds of men preparing to do a large piece of work, the scrape of tools and the low voices and the shuffling of the horse in her stall. She built the fire and made a large breakfast, because they would need it, and brought it out to them at the barn door when the sky was just beginning to go gray in the east. Thomas took the plate, without stopping what he was doing, which was sharpening the scythe with a whetstone. The sound of it going through the still morning air in long, clean strokes, a sound she associated with harvest and had always found satisfying. Eli took his plate and sat on the fence rail and ate quickly the way he ate when he wanted to be done eating so he could get to the work. She went back inside and watched the sky come up. By noon, they had cut the south field. By late afternoon, they had the oats raked into windrows across the stubble, the cut grain drying in the thin September sunshine that was, at least, sunshine. Whatever else it had failed to be this year. Thomas came in for supper with oat chaff in his hair and on his shirt, and a look on his face that was not quite satisfaction, but was something adjacent to it. The look of a man who has gotten through the hard part of a thing. They threshed on the 8th. Ruth helped, holding the grain sacks, while Thomas and Eli beat the sheaves against the threshing board in the barn. The grain falling and the chaff rising in the dusty barn air. May helped too, more in spirit than in effect, carrying the smaller bundles with the focused determination she brought to everything she had decided to take seriously. At the end of the day, Thomas weighed the oats on the larger scale they kept in the barn for this purpose. Ruth stood beside him and watched the numbers. She already knew approximately what they would be, but she let Thomas weigh and call out the numbers, and she wrote them in the account book as he called them. They were better than the corn. They were not good enough. She did not say this when he called out the last number. She wrote it down and closed the book and helped clean up the barn floor. The corn they harvested on the 12th. What was left of it? What the frost had left. Thomas did this one mostly alone, walking the rows of the north field with a knife, cutting the ears that had anything in them worth keeping, leaving the stalks. Eli helped for the first half of the morning, and then Ruth sent him to repair the east fence that had 2 more posts heaved up. Because the fence needed doing, and because she thought Thomas should be alone with the corn. She was right about that. She saw him from the kitchen window, moving slowly through the rows, stopping often. A man doing a kind of accounting with his hands that was different from the accounting she did in the book. More personal, harder to put numbers to. He came in at noon. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down at the table. Ruth put food in front of him and sat down across from him and opened the account book to the harvest page. He did not touch his food. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She went through it the way she always went through it. One category at a time. Each number precise. Each number real. The oats, the corn, the rye that had done reasonably well in the kitchen garden, the potatoes, which were small but numerous, the turnips and beets and the smoked and salted things she had put by through August and September, the hay in the barn. She told him each number. When she was done, she closed the account book and set it on the table between them. Thomas looked at it. He did not look at her. He looked at the book. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the September afternoon was doing what September afternoons did, going gold and long. The light that came through the window at this hour, usually one of the best parts of the day in this kitchen, falling across the table in a warm line. Today, it fell across the account book and the two cold plates of food in Thomas's hands, which were flat on the table on either side of the book. Still, he sat like that for a long time. Ruth waited. She was good at waiting. She had sat across from Thomas Carey for 20 years, and she knew that some things could not be moved faster than they moved, that some moments needed to be what they were, without anyone trying to make them into something else. Eli came in from the east fence. He stopped in the doorway when he felt the air in the kitchen. He looked at Ruth. She looked at him. He came in quietly and sat down at his place and picked up his fork and started eating without saying anything. May was at school. Ruth was grateful for that. Finally, Thomas put both hands around his coffee cup. It had gone cold. He did not drink it. February, he said. If we are careful. Ruth said, yes. Careful? I have already started. He looked up from the book. I know you have, he said. He said it without any edge in it, without anything in it, except the plain fact of the statement, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The wheat flour we can get from Greer, Ruth said. The price will be high. How high? She told him. He breathed out slowly through his nose. What did it cost last January? She told him that too. The difference between the two numbers sat on the table between them. We can sell the two older cows, Thomas said. He said it flat, the way you said something you had decided and did not want to discuss. That takes us past February. Yes, Ruth said. It does. And the horse stays. The horse stays, she agreed. Eli looked up from his plate. He looked at his father and then at his mother. He put his fork down. I can find work in the village, he said. Over the winter. Greer needs someone to split and stack. He told me last week. Thomas looked at him. It would bring in something, Eli said. Not a lot, but something. Ruth looked at her son, 16 years old, offering to spend his winter splitting wood in a cold storage yard for wages that would make a small difference to numbers that needed a large one. The offer was not about the money. She knew that. The offer was about the only thing a person Eli's age could do when he felt the weight of something he had not caused and could not fix, which was to make himself useful in whatever way he could. Yes, Thomas said. All right. Eli nodded and picked up his fork again. The three of them sat at the table in the September light. Ruth took the account book off the table and put it in her lap. She opened it to the back pages, the ones where she wrote things she was watching, and she wrote the date. And then the two numbers Thomas had said, the cows, and the flour price. And under them she wrote Eli. Village, work, winter. Then she wrote one more thing. She wrote it small, at the bottom of the page. And she did not say it out loud, because it was not something she was ready to say out loud. She wrote April. Decision needed. She closed the book. Outside, the September afternoon was going on. The way September afternoons went on. The light doing what the light did. The fields lying open and pale, and used up in the way of fields that had given what they had to give and were waiting now to rest. Thomas picked up his cold coffee and drank it. Eli cleared his plate. Ruth put the account book back in the drawer and got up to heat the coffee. The kitchen went on. The meeting house on the village green had been built in 1804. White clapboard and clean lines, and a bell tower you could see from the north field on clear mornings, if you knew where to look. Ruth had sat in the same pew for 9 years. Third from the front, on the left side. Thomas beside her, and the children between them. Every Sunday, except 2, she had been too sick to leave the house, and one Sunday, in 1812, when the road had flooded, she had never counted the people in the meeting house before October of 1816. She counted them on the first Sunday of the month. 47. She counted again on the second Sunday. 52. By the third Sunday, the building was full in a way she had not seen since Christmas. Every pew occupied. People standing at the back along the wall. The sound of the congregation's breathing filling the space, the way it only filled it when there were enough of them together to make the room feel small. It was not a revival. There was no particular excitement in it. No one standing up to testify or calling out during the sermon. It was quieter than that. It was the quiet of people who had spent a summer being frightened in their own fields, and had come to the one place where frightened people in New England had always come. Not necessarily because they believed it would fix anything, but because they needed somewhere to put it. Reverend Marsh had been in Addison County for 22 years. He was a tall man, thin in the way men got thin when they worked hard and ate simply, with a face Ruth had always found trustworthy, not because it was a particularly expressive face, but because it was a consistent one. He looked the same delivering a sermon as he did splitting firewood or buying flour at Greer's store, which was the face of a man who had decided who he was and was not performing anything. She watched him look out at the full meeting house on the first Sunday of October, and she saw something move across his face before he settled into the opening prayer. A moment of hesitation, small and quickly gone, the look of a man who has prepared something and is suddenly not entirely sure it is the right thing. His text that morning was from the book of Job. He had chosen it deliberately. She understood. Because Job was the story the Bible told about suffering without obvious cause, about a man who had done nothing wrong and lost everything and spent a long time demanding to know why. It was the right text for October of 1816. He preached about suffering as refinement. He used the word providence several times, by which he meant the governing hand of God in human affairs. The idea that what appeared to be random or cruel had a purpose within a larger order that human beings could not see clearly from where they stood. He was careful with it. She could hear the care. He did not say that God had made the summer cold. He said that God was present within the cold summer, which was a different claim and a harder one to dispute. The congregation listened the way congregations listened when they needed what was being said to be true. Ruth listened too. She sat with her hands in her lap, and Thomas beside her, and May pressed against her left side, as May always pressed in church. And she listened to Reverend Marsh talk about providence and refinement, and she thought about the scale on her kitchen table and the numbers in the back of the account book and the 2 cows Thomas had sold the week before. Walked down the road by a man from the next county who had paid a price that was lower than Thomas had wanted and higher than Thomas had feared. She sat with it privately, in the 3rd pew, and she thought that a summer like this one was the kind of thing that required either a very large faith or a very honest doubt, and that she was not sure, at this moment, which one she had. She was not going to say this to anyone. It was not the kind of thing you said in a community like this one. Not because you would be punished for it, but because other people were holding on to the settled thing, and you did not pull the rope when other people were using it to stand up. After the service, they stood in the yard, the way they always stood. Thomas found Whitfield, and the 2 of them talked in the low, serious way that farmers talked in the fall. Ruth stood with Patience Wheeler and a woman named Good who had a farm on the South Road. Good said she had written to her sister in Connecticut, and her sister had said it was the same there. Cold summer, short harvest. Patience, said her cousin in Stratford, had said the same. Ruth said her sister in Massachusetts had said the same in her last letter. The 3 of them stood with this shared information, the knowledge that it was not local, not a misfortune specific to Addison County, but something larger, something that had covered all of New England the same way. My husband says it is the sun. Good said. He says the sun is weaker than it was. What does that mean? Patience asked. The sun cannot be weaker. He read something in a paper from Burlington about dark spots on the sun. He says when there are spots, the sun is weaker. Ruth did not say anything. She had heard this theory from Thomas, who had heard it from someone at the mill. She had thought about it and found it unsatisfying, not because it was impossible, but because it did not explain why the sunsets had been the color they had been all summer. That deep, strange orange-red that had appeared every clear evening since May, and that was unlike anything she had seen in 38 years of Vermont skies. Sunspots would change how much light reached the earth. Ruth understood that much. But sunspots would not change the color of the light itself, would not make the sky at dusk look like something was burning far away and below the horizon. The sunset color was a different thing from the cold. And yet they had arrived together in the same wrong summer, and she could not make herself believe that 2 things arriving together had nothing to do with each other. She did not say this. She did not have anything to put in its place. Reverend Marsh came and stood with them for a few minutes, stopping at each group the way he moved through the yard after service, attentive and unhurried. He asked after their farms. They told him, in the restrained way people told ministers things, the outline without the full weight of the numbers. He listened. He said he was grateful they had come through as well as they had. He said the congregation was supporting one another, and that this was what the congregation was for. Ruth looked at him while he said this, and she thought he believed it, and she thought it was not enough, and she thought he probably knew it was not enough, and that he was saying it anyway, because it was the truest thing he had that was also kind. After he moved on, May appeared at Ruth's side. Reverend Marsh looked tired. May said, "Yes." Ruth said. Does he know why the summer was cold? Ruth looked down at her daughter. No, she said. I do not think anyone knows. Does God know? Ruth took May's hand. That is a good question, she said. That means you do not want to answer it. May said. It means I am still thinking about the answer, Ruth said, which was the most honest thing she could say and was true. They walked home through the October afternoon. Ruth and Thomas and May, along the road that ran beside the creek, and then turned up through the maple grove that was in its full color now. Red and orange and yellow against the gray sky, the maples holding their leaves longer than usual, as if they too were reluctant to let the season go. At home, Eli was sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper notice from Ohio open in front of him. He folded it up quickly when they came in, but not before Ruth saw it. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg and said nothing. That evening, after Thomas had gone up and May was in her room, Eli came downstairs and sat across from her at the table. She was mending. He sat for a while before he spoke. I have been thinking about what Reverend Marsh said today, he said. About providence. She kept her eyes on the mending. He said that suffering had a purpose we could not see clearly from where we stood. Eli's voice was careful, choosing his words the way he always chose them. I have been sitting with that all day. She waited. I think maybe the same suffering asks different things of different people, he said. Maybe it is telling you and Father to stay, and maybe it is telling me something else. He did not finish the sentence. Ruth set the mending down. Eli, she said. He looked at her. I do not know what God means by this summer, she said. I have sat in that pew every Sunday for 9 years, and I am going to be honest with you. I do not know. What I know is that we still have to get through the winter. She paused. And what you decide about spring is yours to decide. But I need you here through the winter. He nodded. I know, he said. I am not going anywhere until spring. All right, she said. She picked up the mending again. He sat there a while longer, and then he went upstairs. She sat alone. The fire was low. She put a log on and watched it catch. She thought about providence, and about the scale on the table, and about the 2 cows that were gone, and the seed corn jar that was empty on the cellar shelf. Maybe that was providence. She did not know. She was not going to say so from a pulpit. What she knew was that she had watched and counted and prepared, and that the preparing had mattered. Whether something larger had moved her hands to the jar in September, or whether it had been the long practice of a woman who had learned to watch for what was coming. She could not say, but she thought about the sunsets again. That deep, wrong orange that had no local explanation, that had appeared the same week as the strange haze in the sky, that neither sunspots nor weather nor anything she knew about Vermont could account for. She thought about the fact that Patience's cousin in Stratford had seen the same sunsets, that her sister in Massachusetts had mentioned them in her letter. Something had changed in the sky before any of this began. She turned to the back pages of the account book and she wrote the date. October 1816. She wrote, Something changed in the sky before this summer started. Not here. Not local. The sunsets are wrong from here to Massachusetts to Connecticut. I do not know what changed it. I do not know where it came from. I know It was not here the year before. She paused, with the pen in her hand. Then she wrote one more line. Find out, if you can, what makes a sunset that color. She closed the book. She went to the window and looked out at the October evening. The sun was going down behind the western hills. And even now, even in October, when the cold had settled in and the leaves were half down and the fields were empty, the sky was doing it again. That deep, strange orange-red spreading up from the horizon. Beautiful and wrong. Too saturated. Too long-lasting. The color of something burning far away, in a place none of them could see. She looked at it for a long time, then she went to bed. The first letter came on a Tuesday. Ruth knew it was from her sister before she opened it because of the handwriting on the outside. Her sister Clara's script that leaned hard to the right the way it had since Clara was 10 years old, and learning her letters in their father's house in New Hampshire. The letter had been written in September and had taken 6 weeks to arrive, which was not unusual for the mail in autumn when the roads went soft. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. Clara and her husband James farmed outside Worcester in Massachusetts. A larger farm than the Carey place. Better soil. A longer growing season by 2 weeks on average. Ruth had always thought of Clara's farm as the easier one. The one where a bad year was a bad year rather than a crisis. She had thought this for 9 years, and she had not been wrong until now. Clara wrote the way she always wrote. Directly and without decoration. She said the corn had failed. She said the hay had come up short. She said James had sold 2 of their 3 horses in August because they could not afford to feed them. She said the price of flour in Worcester had risen to a level she described as shocking, and then gave the number. And the number was higher than what Ruth was paying in Addison County. She said James was talking about selling the farm. Ruth read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept the account book, and she went on with her morning because there was no other choice about going on with the morning. She told Thomas about the failed corn and the short hay and the flour price. He listened, and then he looked out the window at the November fields and said, quietly, that he had heard similar from the men at the mill, that it was everywhere in the county, that Whitfield had cousins in the Connecticut River Valley who had sent word that the river valley was the same, that a man who came through from Albany last week had said it was the same in New York. How far does it go? Thomas said. He was not asking her. He was asking the window. I do not know, she said. The second letter came the following week, from a woman named Helen Ames, who had been Ruth's closest friend before Helen married and moved to Portsmouth in New Hampshire 12 years ago. They wrote twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer. This was an additional letter, written in October, outside the usual pattern, which meant Helen had something to say that could not wait for Christmas. Helen wrote that Portsmouth had experienced the worst summer in memory, that her husband had lost 2 months of work because the men who would have hired him had no money to spare, that food prices in Portsmouth were such that families she knew, families that had never gone without, were going without. She wrote this carefully, without self-pity. But the care itself was a measure of how serious it was. At the bottom of the letter, Helen wrote, I have heard from my cousin in London that England has had the same summer, cold and wet, all through July and August. Harvest failed across much of the country. Bread prices higher than they have been in 20 years. She writes that people in the countryside are hungry and that in the cities it is worse. I do not understand how the same bad weather can have reached both sides of the ocean. I am writing to ask if you have heard anything about why. Ruth read that paragraph 3 times. She had not heard anything about why, but she had been thinking about the same question since the summer, since she had written in the back pages that the sunsets were wrong from Vermont to Massachusetts to Connecticut. She had been thinking about it the way she thought about things she did not have enough information to answer, holding the question without forcing it, waiting for what she was missing to show itself. She went to the drawer and took out both letters and laid them on the kitchen table. She opened the account book to the back pages and read what she had written in October. Something changed in the sky before this summer started. She looked at Clara's letter, Massachusetts. She looked at Helen's letter, New Hampshire, England. She went to the stack of newspapers on the shelf above the fireplace. 3 months' worth, that she had been setting aside meaning to read when she had time. She took the stack down and brought it to the table. She read through the papers that afternoon while the bread was in the oven. She read slowly, not looking for anything specific, reading the way she read when she was looking for something she could not yet name. In the Burlington paper from August, she found a notice from a correspondent in Philadelphia who wrote that the summer had been the coldest and most dismal in living memory throughout the Atlantic states, that crops from Georgia to Maine had suffered, and that some natural philosophers were beginning to examine whether the cause might be found in the upper atmosphere rather than in local conditions. Upper atmosphere. She stopped at that phrase. She thought about the haze in June. High up. No smoke smell. She thought about the sunsets. That wrong, deep orange that came from below the horizon and stayed too long. She thought about something that was in the air, above Vermont, and above Massachusetts, and above New Hampshire, and above England all at the same time. Something that had changed the light before it reached the ground. She wrote it in the back of the account book under what she had written in October. Upper atmosphere. She drew a line under it and sat with it. She did not know what was in the upper atmosphere. She did not have the knowledge to answer that. But she had the outline of a shape now. The shape of something that had happened somewhere and sent its effects outward to reach Vermont and Massachusetts and New Hampshire and England all at once. The way a stone dropped in still water sent its rings outward in all directions, touching every shore. Something had dropped. She did not know what or where. The bread needed turning. She got up and went to the oven. The third letter came at the end of November, from a minister named Edward Parsons, who had been a friend of her father's in New Hampshire and who had moved south to Virginia 10 years ago to take a congregation there. He wrote to Ruth once a year at Christmas. This was not the Christmas letter. Reverend Parsons wrote that he had experienced something in the summer of 1816 that he felt compelled to share with people he trusted. He had been visiting a colleague in Richmond in July and had encountered a man there who had recently arrived from Europe, a merchant who had traveled through France and Switzerland on business. This man had told Reverend Parsons something that had stayed with him. He had said that in the spring of 1815, in the waters east of the island of Java, in the Dutch East Indies, he had heard and felt something he could not explain. A sound like distant cannon fire, felt as much as heard, accompanied by a trembling of the water beneath his ship. He had later learned from Dutch officials in Batavia that a great mountain on the island of Sumbawa, far to the east, had erupted in a way those officials described as beyond any they had knowledge of. The mountain was called Tambora. Reverend Parsons wrote that he did not know what to make of this in relation to the cold summer. He wrote that he was not a man of science and that he offered this information without conclusion, only as something he thought Ruth might find of interest given her habit of mind, which he had always admired, of watching things and keeping track. He wrote that the merchant had said the eruption had been heard more than 1,000 miles away. He wrote, "I leave it to you to make of this what you will." Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hand for a long time. She read it again. Sumbawa, a mountain that had erupted in the spring of 1815, a sound heard 1,000 miles away. And then, in the summer of 1816, a cold that had reached from Virginia to Vermont to England, a haze in the sky that had no source anyone could name, sunsets, the color of something burning far away. She got up and went to the shelf and found the almanac from 1815 and looked through it. There was nothing about Sumbawa. There was nothing about any eruption in the Dutch East Indies. The almanac was a Vermont almanac, and it concerned itself with Vermont. And what happened on an island in the Java Sea in April of 1815 was not something a Vermont almanac would have noted. She went back to the table. She opened the account book to the back pages, and she read everything she had written there since March. The maple run, the cold ground, the light in May, the haze in June, the wrong sunsets, the upper atmosphere. She read all of it, and she thought about the merchant on his ship in the waters east of Java, feeling the mountain through the hull of the vessel. And she thought about the year that had followed. She wrote one more entry. She wrote the date, and then she wrote a mountain called Tambora, island of Sumbawa, Dutch East Indies, spring of 1815. Something that large, that far away, reaching England, reaching Vermont. I cannot say for certain, but I cannot say it did not. She looked at what she had written. She did not underline it. She was not certain enough to underline it, but she did not cross it out either. She sat with it for a while. Then she closed the book. She called May in from the yard for supper. That evening she told Thomas. She told him about all 3 letters. She told him about the Philadelphia notice and the upper atmosphere. She told him about the mountain called Tambora and the merchant ship. Thomas listened without interrupting, his coffee growing cold in his hands. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "A mountain in the Dutch East Indies. That is what Reverend Parsons was told. And you think that is what did all this?" "I think it might be," she said. "I cannot say for certain. I am not a philosopher of nature. But I have been watching the sky since May, and something was in it that had no local explanation. And a mountain that erupted on the other side of the world in the spring of the year before is the first thing I have heard that is large enough to have reached everywhere at once." Thomas looked at his coffee. "We will never know for certain," he said. "No," she said. "Probably not." He looked up at her. "Does it change anything? Knowing it might be a mountain?" She thought about this honestly. "No," she said. "The corn is still what it is. The account book is still what it is." She paused. "But it changes the question." "What question?" "Whether it will happen again," she said. "If it was local weather, it might happen again any year. If it was a mountain, and the mountain is done, then perhaps the sky will clear." She looked at him. "That matters for spring," Thomas was quiet for a long time. April, he said. Yes, she said. April. Eli had been sitting at the far end of the table through this conversation, reading, or appearing to read. He set his book down now. He looked at his mother. If the sky clears, he said, carefully, the summer next year should be normal. That is what I would expect. Ruth said. Eli looked at his father. Thomas looked at the table. A long moment passed among the three of them, in which a great deal was understood without anyone saying anything. All right, Thomas said finally. He said it to no one in particular, and to all of them at once. Ruth got up to clear the supper things. May helped without being asked, carrying plates to the basin, the way she had started doing in September, quietly, and without anyone making it a lesson. The 3 letters lay on the table. Clara in Massachusetts, Helen in New Hampshire, Reverend Parsons in Virginia. All of them watching different pieces of the same thing from different distances. None of them able to see the whole of it. Each of them reaching across the distance to say what they had seen. Ruth washed the plates. Outside, the November night was cold and clear, the stars hard and bright, the sky doing nothing unusual, offering no evidence of what it had carried all summer, and what it might or might not still be carrying now. She dried her hands and went to the drawer and took out the account book and wrote the date and a single line. 3 letters today, all saying the same thing from different places. She paused. Then she wrote, "The world is larger than Vermont and smaller than I thought." She closed the book and went upstairs. It was not one argument. It was many small ones, spread across 2 months, each one brief and careful and freighted with the weight of what no one was quite ready to say directly. The first one happened on a Thursday evening in early November. Eli had come in from his work at Greer's store, where he had been splitting and stacking wood since the first week of October. He came in cold and tired and smelling of sawdust, and he sat down at the supper table and ate quickly, and then said, without looking up from his plate, that Jacob Whitfield had booked passage on a wagon company leaving for Ohio in the 3rd week of April. Thomas, across the table, did not say anything. Ruth, at the stove, kept her back where it was. Booked passage. Thomas said finally, "That costs money. Jacob has been saving." Eli said, "Since last winter. Has he?" "Yes." Thomas picked up his fork and ate for a while. May looked from her father to her brother and back again, with the alertness of a child who understood that she was in the middle of something without being told what the something was. "Ohio is a long way," Thomas said. "Yes," Eli said. "It is." That was the whole of it that night. They finished supper, and Eli went upstairs, and Thomas sat by the fire with his pipe, and Ruth did the dishes. And nobody said anything more about Ohio until the 2nd week of November, when Thomas came in from the barn on a Sunday morning, and mentioned, while hanging up his coat, that Whitfield Sr. had told him after church that Jacob was a fool, and he had told him so. Eli, who was sitting at the table, said nothing. A young man going alone to a territory he does not know, Thomas said. To the coat hook. No family. No established farm. No certainty. Jacob is not going alone. Eli said, "There are 4 of them." Thomas turned around. 4 boys who do not know Ohio. Men, Eli said. Jacob is 18. 18, Thomas said, and said it in a way that covered everything he thought about 18. Ruth kept her attention on the bread she was shaping. She did not look at either of them. I am not Jacob, Eli said. No, Thomas said. You are not. He went to the fire and stood with his back to it. The way he stood when he was done with a conversation without being done with it. Eli picked up his book. Ruth set the bread to rise and wiped her hands and went to check on May upstairs. In the third week of November, Patience Wheeler's eldest son, Nathaniel, left for Boston with a letter of introduction to a merchant there, seeking work for the winter with the intention of going further west in the spring. This was the first person in their immediate circle to actually leave, and it shifted something in the air. Ruth felt it at church the following Sunday. A new quality in the conversations afterward. Something between resignation and relief in the people whose children had decided to go, and something harder and less nameable in the people whose children had not yet decided. Thomas felt it too. She could tell from the way he came home from church that Sunday, with his jaw set at the angle it set when he was thinking about something he did not want to think about. At supper, he said, Nathaniel Wheeler is gone. I know, Ruth said. His mother did not seem. He stopped. She was not what I would call at ease. No, Ruth said. I expect not. Eli looked at his plate. Thomas looked at Eli. I want to ask you something directly, he said. Eli put his fork down. Are you going? Thomas said. Or are you not? The kitchen was very quiet. The fire, the wind outside. May, who had gone very still over her food. Eli looked at his father. I am thinking about it, he said. I have not decided. What would decide it? Eli was quiet for a moment, choosing with care. Whether next summer is different, he said. Whether the farm does what a farm should do? Thomas looked at him for a long moment. And if it does, then I would have a reason to stay, Eli said. Something moved across Thomas's face. Brief, and then gone. Ruth saw it, and it was something close to relief. The particular relief of a man who has been afraid of one answer and has gotten a different one. All right, Thomas said. He picked up his fork. Then we see what next summer does. Ruth said nothing. She knew it was not finished, but it was set aside, which was what the family did with the things that were too large to settle in one supper. And the supper went on. The real conversation happened on a Sunday evening in the middle of December. It happened the way the true conversations in this house always happened. After May was in bed, and Eli had gone up, and it was just the two of them at the kitchen table with the fire going low. Thomas had been quiet all day in the particular way he was quiet when he had something to say and had not yet found how to say it. She was mending. She was always mending. He said, I need to tell you something. She kept the needle moving. All right. I have been afraid, he said. She looked up. He was looking at the fire. He held his coffee in both hands, the way he held things when he needed something to hold. Not of the coal, he said. Not of the short harvest. I have been afraid that if Eli goes, it means I failed at something, that the farm was not enough. Ruth set the mending down. Thomas, she said. He looked at her. The farm did not fail, she said. The sky failed. There is a difference. He was quiet. Eli leaving. If he leaves, is not a judgment on what you built, she said. It is a young man needing more land than an established farm can give him. That is not failure. That is what young men do when the farm is already someone else's. Thomas looked at his coffee. My father farmed beside his father. Your grandfather had a farm large enough for two. Ruth said, We do not. He breathed out slowly. The fire settled. Outside, the December wind moved against the house. If he goes, Thomas said, What is this farm for? Ruth looked at her husband. She had been thinking about this question for 2 months. Since she had written April, decision needed in the back of the account book. She had been thinking about it, and she still did not have an answer that would satisfy him. But she had the honest one. It is for us, she said, and for May, and for whoever May brings to it eventually, and for the work itself, which is real work and good work and does not require a son in it to be worth doing. He was quiet for a long time. I know that, he said finally. I know it. You are allowed to also grieve it, she said. Knowing something and grieving it are not the same. He looked at her. It was the look he had given her at rare moments over 20 years of marriage. The look that said she had said something he needed and had not known he needed. And she held it for a moment, the way you held the things you were given that you knew were not given often. What do you want? He said. What does Ruth Carey want? Not as the woman who keeps the account and watches the cellar, but as herself. She thought about it honestly. I want next summer to be normal, she said. I want the corn to come in, and the hay to be tall, and the cellar to be full by October. I want May to run barefoot in July, the way she should have run barefoot this July. She paused. And I want Eli to stay, but I want him to stay because he chooses to, not because we made it impossible to go. Thomas nodded slowly. He set his coffee down. Then we tell him in the spring, he said. Whatever he decides is his to decide. Yes, she said. They sat for a while longer. The fire burned low. Ruth went back to the mending, and Thomas sat with his empty cup, and the December wind pushed against the north side of the house with the steady pressure of a winter that still had months to go. After a while, Thomas said, without particular emphasis, as though it were a simple observation, I am glad you put that seed corn back in September. Ruth kept her eyes on the mending. I know, she said. 14 months ago, he said. You already knew. I was watching, she said. I did not know. He was quiet. Then, you always know before I do. I watch differently, she said. That is all. He got up and put another log on the fire and went upstairs. Ruth sat a while longer with the mending and the fire and the December night outside. She thought about the mountain called Tambora on its island in the Java Sea, which had done what it had done in April of 1815 and was, according to what Reverend Parsons had written, silent now. She thought about the upper atmosphere and the haze that had sat in the Vermont sky all summer, and the sunsets that had burned too long in colors that belonged to somewhere else. She thought about whether the sky would be clear in June of 1817. She did not know. She could not know. She could watch, and she could count, and she could keep the account, and she could put the seed corn back in the jar on the cellar shelf where she had already put this year's seed. The new jar, full, waiting. That was what she could do. She finished the piece she was mending and folded it and set it on the pile and put the needle away. She went to the drawer and took out the account book and opened it to the back pages and read the last entry. 3 letters today, all saying the same thing from different places. The world is larger than Vermont and smaller than I thought. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date. December 1816. She wrote, "We will see what the sky does." She closed the book. She went upstairs. The house was quiet around her as she climbed. May, asleep. Eli, asleep. Thomas already breathing slow in their room. She stood for a moment at the top of the stairs in the dark. The account book was in the drawer. The seed corn was in the jar. The fire was banked against the night. The sky outside the window at the end of the hall was clear and full of stars, cold and distant and giving nothing away. She went to bed. The cold that came in January was an honest cold. Ruth understood the difference now in a way she had not understood it a year ago. There was the cold of a normal winter, which was deep and steady and arrived when it was supposed to arrive and did what cold was supposed to do, which was sit on the land and hold it and then, in March, begin to let go. And there was the cold of 1816, which had been something else. A cold that came when warmth was owed, that arrived in June on the backs of young corn plants and in August on tassels that were almost finished, and that had the quality not of a season but of a refusal. A sky that had decided not to do what skies in Vermont were supposed to do. The cold of January 1817 was honest. It was deep and dark and long, and she did not trust it yet the way she had trusted it before. She might not trust any cold the same way again. But it was at least doing what cold in January was supposed to do. What it was also doing was pressing on everything the summer had left thin. The hay in the barn was the first thing. She had known since August that they were short on hay, and she had managed the shortfall the way she managed everything, by watching it closely and moving around it carefully, reducing what the remaining cattle ate by small enough increments that the animals adjusted without distress. But January was when hay shortfalls showed themselves fully, when the winter was half done and the supply was already more than half spent, and the arithmetic of it became a daily rather than a weekly calculation. Thomas went to the barn every morning and came back with a number. How much was left? She wrote it in the account book and divided it by the days left until the grass would come. The number that resulted from that division was always smaller than it needed to be. They were not going to lose the cattle. She was certain of that. But by February, they would be feeding them less than was ideal, and by March, they would be feeding them considerably less than was ideal, and the animals would come through the winter thinner than they should be, and less ready for the work of spring than she wanted. This was the kind of problem you lived with. The flour was the second thing. She had bought flour from Greer in October at the high October price, and again in November at a price that was higher still. The flour in the bin by the stairs would last, but the buying of it at those prices had taken money they had not planned to spend, and the money they had not planned to spend was money they did not have for other things. And the other things kept presenting themselves with the blunt insistence of things that needed tending. The lamp oil, the salt, a new axe handle when the old one split in December, a small purchase, An ordinary purchase in an ordinary year. The kind of thing that cost what it cost, and was thought about no further. In January of 1817, Ruth thought about the axe handle. She thought about it briefly and practically, and then she stopped thinking about it because that was the only useful relationship to have with the things you could not change. May got sick on the 8th of January. A fever. The ordinary winter fever that came to children every few years. And Ruth recognized it for what it was when she felt May's forehead on the morning of the 8th and found it dry and hot in the particular way that meant the body was fighting something and needed help to win. She had seen this before. She knew what to do. She put May to bed in the downstairs room near the fire, where it was warmest. She made broth from the smoked hen bones she had been saving in the cellar for exactly this kind of occasion. A rich, dark broth that she had learned from her mother. The kind of thing that had no name in any book, but that worked in the way things passed down for generations worked, which was reliably and without explanation. She kept the fire high. She changed the cool cloths on May's forehead through the afternoon and into the evening. May slept most of the first day. On the evening of the second day, she was awake and talking, and she asked Ruth why the light through the window looked different from the light in summer. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. "It is winter," she said. "The sun is lower in the sky. It does not feel like summer light," May said. "No," Ruth said. "It does not." May was quiet for a moment, her face flushed and her eyes bright with the fever. "Last summer the light was different too," she said, "but different in a different way. Not low like winter, just wrong." Ruth looked at her daughter. "Do you remember that?" she said. "Yes," May said. It made the shadows look like the wrong time of day. She paused. The way she paused when she was thinking something through. "Do you know why yet?" Ruth smoothed the cloth on May's forehead. "I think I might know," she said. "A mountain. Very far away. Put something in the sky. And the something changed the light." May thought about this. A mountain. Yes. How far away? The other side of the world. May was quiet. Ruth could see her working with this. Turning it over? The way May turned things over when she was deciding whether to believe them. If it was the other side of the world, she said. "How did it get here?" "The sky goes all the way around," Ruth said. "There are no fences in the sky." May looked at the ceiling. "That is a strange thing," she said. "Yes," Ruth said. "It is." May's fever broke on the third day. By the fifth day she was out of bed and eating at the table. Thinner and quieter than usual, but herself. The alertness back in her eyes and the directness back in her questions. Ruth watched her daughter come back to herself and felt the feeling that parents felt when a sick child recovered. A feeling that had no clean name, but that was made of relief and gratitude, and a kind of sharpened attention to the ordinary. The way illness reminded you of what you had when it was over. The morning after May came back to the table, Ruth went to the cellar. She went down with the lamp, and she stood in the familiar cold, and she looked at the shelves, the flour bin, the crocks of beans, including the two she had put up in August with Patience Wheeler's mother's method. Still sealed, still good. The remaining salt pork, the potatoes in their bin, still firm, better than she had hoped. The smoked meat hanging from the ceiling, diminished from what it had been in October, but still there. The pumpkins along the south wall, a few of them gone soft, but most of them still good. She stood there for a while with the lamp held up. She had looked at these shelves in fear in August, in calculation in September and October and November, in the disciplined acceptance of December. She looked at them now in January with something else, something that was not yet ease, but was the beginning of ease, the beginning of the knowledge that she was going to get through this, not comfortably, not without the weeks ahead being weeks of careful management and reduced portions, and the hay running thin in the barn, and the lamp oil measured out more precisely than she liked. But through, she counted what was left. She went back upstairs and wrote the numbers in the account book and did the calculation she did every week, dividing what was left by the weeks remaining. The number was smaller than she wanted. It was larger than the alternative. Thomas came in from the barn. He hung his coat and his hat and sat down. She put coffee in front of him. He looked at the account book, open on the table. "How are we?" he said. "Through February," she said. "March will be lean?" He nodded. He drank his coffee. "Eli talked to me this morning," he said, "while we were feeding the cattle." Ruth sat down. "What did he say?" Thomas looked at his coffee cup. He turned it in his hands the way he turned things when he was measuring what to say. He said he wanted to wait until the corn was in the ground before he decided anything about Ohio. He paused. He said he wanted to see what the spring looks like. Ruth said nothing. He also said, Thomas continued, more slowly, that if he goes, he wants to go, knowing that we are settled. He said those words. Settled. He looked up. I think he means he will not go if he thinks we cannot manage. Ruth looked at her husband. We can manage, she said. I know we can. Thomas said, I need to make sure he knows it. Then tell him. Thomas nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, the January wind pushed against the house with its honest January pressure, and the barn creaked in the cold the way it always creaked, and the cattle moved in their stalls with the slow patience of animals that had learned to wait. Ruth closed the account book. She thought about Eli in the barn that morning, telling his father he wanted to wait and see the spring. She thought about what it meant that he had said it to Thomas and not to her. She thought it meant that Eli had understood something important about his father, which was that Thomas needed to be part of the conversation rather than informed of the conclusion, and that Eli, at 16, had the wisdom to know this and act on it. She was proud of him for that. She did not say so. There would be time to say so. May came downstairs, still moving more carefully than usual, but moving, her color better, her eyes clear. She sat down at the table and looked at the account book and then at her mother. Are we all right? She asked. Ruth looked at her daughter, 9 years old, with the directness she had been born with, asking the question she had been holding since August, with the patience of a child who had learned that the right moment to ask was when the answer might actually be given. Yes, Ruth said, we are all right. May looked at her with the assessing look she used when she was deciding whether an answer was the whole truth or only part of it. Ruth held her daughter's gaze and did not add anything because there was nothing to add. Okay, May said. She reached across the table and took a piece of bread from the plate Ruth had set out and ate it slowly and with attention. Tasting it, Ruth watched her daughter eat and did not say anything else. The account book was closed on the table. The fire was going. The cold outside was doing what January cold was supposed to do. They were all right, lean and diminished and different from what they had been in January of 1816, when the cellar was full, and the year ahead had seemed like all the others, but all right. On the other side of the world, on an island that none of them had ever seen, in a sea that none of them could have named, there was a mountain that no longer looked like a mountain. What remained of Mount Tambora stood on the peninsula of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies, roughly 8,000 miles from the kitchen where Ruth Carey sat with her account book and her cold February mornings. Before April of 1815, it had been the tallest peak in the region, a cone rising nearly 15,000 feet above the sea, visible from ships far out in the Java Sea, a landmark that sailors had used for generations. After April of 1815, it was 4,000 feet shorter. What happened on the night of April 10th, 1815, was the largest eruption any living person on Earth had witnessed or would witness in their lifetimes. The mountain did not simply erupt, it collapsed inward and then outward simultaneously, releasing energy of a scale that has few comparisons in the written record of human history. The sound of it was heard by people on ships more than 1,000 miles away, the same sound that a merchant had described to Reverend Parsons in Richmond, the sound, like distant cannon fire, felt through the hull of a vessel in the dark waters east of Java. On the Tambora Peninsula itself, the communities that had existed for generations were gone within hours. Rivers of superheated gas and ash moved outward from the mountain faster than anything living could outrun them. The people who had farmed the slopes for centuries, who had spoken a language that existed nowhere else on Earth, had no warning that was sufficient and no place to go that was far enough. Thousands died that night. Tens of thousands more died in the months that followed from the famine and disease that spread across the surrounding islands, when the ash covered the crops and the water and left nothing that could be eaten. One language, now known only through fragments, vanished with the last of its speakers in those weeks. Not gradually, all at once. The Dutch officials in Batavia wrote reports. The reports made their way to Europe slowly. By the time they arrived, the summer of 1816 was already underway in the Northern Hemisphere, and the connection between the mountain and the cold was not one that anyone had yet made clearly enough to put into official correspondence. It was not the ash that reached Vermont. The heavy ash from Tambora fell close to the mountain, covering the nearby islands in a gray blanket that smothered what the fire had not already taken. What traveled further, invisibly and without stopping, was sulfur dioxide. The eruption sent somewhere near 50 million tons of it into the stratosphere, the high layer of the atmosphere that sits above the weather, above the clouds, above the reach of ordinary wind and rain. In the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide does not settle. It reacts with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols, a thin and invisible dispersal that spread outward from Sumbawa in all directions through the spring and summer of 1815. By the autumn of 1815, the aerosol veil had circled the globe. It was thin enough to be invisible to the eye. It was dense enough to reflect a small but measurable fraction of incoming sunlight back into space before it reached the ground. Scientists who have since studied this period estimate that the veil reduced the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth's surface by something between 1 and 2%. 1% sounds like nothing. On a farm in Vermont where corn needed 90 days of adequate summer warmth to mature, where the margin between a good harvest and a failed one was measured in weeks, and the margin between a failed harvest and a catastrophic one was measured in days. 1% of the sun taken away meant the warmth that arrived was not quite the warmth that was required, and the thing that was not quite enough was, in the end, not enough. It was also the veil that made the sunsets wrong. Sunlight passing through the sulfate aerosol layer at a low angle, as it did at dusk, was scattered in ways that ordinary air did not scatter it. The orange and red wavelengths amplified and extended across the western sky long after the sun was down. The same sky that Ruth Carey was watching over her north field was being watched by others far away. In Britain, a painter named J.M.W. Turner was recording in his sketchbooks the unusual evening colors over the Thames, colors that art historians would later note as distinct from anything in his earlier work. Colors that have since been linked to the atmospheric changes following Tambora, on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. A small group of writers confined indoors by the relentless cold and rain of a summer that felt like winter were telling each other ghost stories by candlelight. Among them was an 18-year-old woman named Mary Godwin, who would later become Mary Shelley. In those dark weeks beside a lake that should have been warm and was not, she began writing a story about a scientist who created something beyond his ability to control, something that moved through the world without being fully understood by anyone who encountered it. She would publish the book in 1818. She called it Frankenstein. Ruth Carey was looking at the same veil that Turner was painting and that Mary Shelley was writing inside. She was looking at the light of Tambora, the same light reaching Vermont and Britain and Switzerland from the same invisible source. She did not know this. She could not have known this. She was a woman in Addison County with an account book and a cellar and a family to bring through a winter. And the connection between her north field and a mountain in the Java Sea and a painter on the Thames and a young woman beside a Swiss lake was a connection that no one in 1816 had the information to make completely. What she had was the question. She had written it in the back pages in October. Find out, if you can, what makes a sunset that color. She had written in November, a mountain called Tambora. She had written, I cannot say for certain, but I cannot say it did not. She had felt the shape of the thing. She had done what she always did, which was watch and count and write down what she could not yet name. And in doing so, she had gotten closer to the truth of 1816 than most people who lived through it ever would. In February of 1817, the stratosphere above Vermont was beginning, slowly and without announcement, to clear. The sulfate aerosols were dispersing, losing their concentration. The veil that had circled the globe since the autumn of 1815 was thinning. It would not be gone completely for another year, but it was thinning, and the thinning mattered, because the light that came through was already fractionally more than the light that had come through the summer before. Nobody in Vermont could measure this. Nobody in Vermont had the instruments or the knowledge to know it was happening. What they had was February, going on the way February was supposed to go. Cold and long, and without any of the strange qualities that had marked the cold of the year before. Thomas Carey checked the tap he had set in the big maple every morning the way he had checked it every February for 20 years. In the middle of the month, on a morning when the temperature had gone above freezing for the first time in 3 weeks, he came back to the house with something in his face that Ruth recognized before he said a word. She put down what she was doing. "Sap," he said. "Yes, just a little. Just starting." He looked at his hand, where a thin smear of the pale liquid was drying on his palm. "But it is running?" Ruth looked at her husband's hand. The sap was running. On time. Running in February the way it was supposed to run. The way it had run every year before 1816. She looked at Thomas's hand for a moment. Then she went to the drawer and took out the account book and opened it to the back pages and found the entry from March of 1816, the first entry she had ever written there. "Maples not running." She read those 3 words. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote the date and wrote 3 more. "Maples are running." She closed the book and put it back in the drawer. Thomas was still standing there with his hand out, the pale smear of sap on his palm. "It is going to be all right," he said. He said it not as a conclusion, but as something he was deciding, the way you decided things, that you had been afraid to decide for a long time. Ruth looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." The mud came in March, the way mud always came in Vermont, which was completely and without apology. It came when the frost began to leave the ground, working its way up from below as the earth warmed, and when the frost left, it took the ground's solidity with it and left in its place a substance that was neither solid nor liquid, deep and dark and patient, that pulled at boots and filled wheel ruts and made the road between the farm and the village a thing to be crossed carefully and only when necessary. Ruth had spent 9 mud seasons on this farm, and she had her own relationship with March mud, which was one of respectful coexistence. This March, the mud was welcome, not the mud itself, but what the mud meant, which was that the frost was leaving the ground on schedule, that the ground was warming as it was supposed to warm, that March was doing in 1817 what March had refused to do in 1816. She noticed it with a quality of attention that was different from how she had noticed it in previous years. Sharper and more conscious. The attention of a person who had spent a year watching ordinary things fail to be ordinary, and who was now watching ordinary things be ordinary again and could not quite take it for granted the way she once had. She did not think she would ever entirely take it for granted again. The maple run had come in February, early, on schedule, and Thomas and Eli had tapped the grove properly in the first week of March, and the sap had run well. Enough to fill the evaporating pan 6 times through the middle of the month and produce a supply of syrup that Ruth calculated would last the year with some left over. She had watched Thomas at the evaporating pan in the cold March mornings, with the steam rising around him, and she had thought about the dry bucket hanging under the tap in March of 1816. And she had not said anything because there was nothing to say that the full bucket did not already say better. The ground in the north field was soft by the 3rd week of March. Thomas checked it every morning the way he had always checked it. Going out before breakfast, coming back in, reporting what his hands told him. On the morning of the 21st, he came in and sat down and said that another week, maybe 10 days, and they could start turning. Ruth was at the stove. She said that was good to hear. He said he wanted to put in more than just corn this year. He said he had been thinking about a wider mix. Some of the north field in corn, as always, but some in winter rye, and some in a field pea that Whitfield had told him about, a variety that matured faster than regular peas, and could be put in early and would be done before the summer heat, if the summer heat came, as it should. He said this, the way he said things, he had thought about carefully before saying, with a considered quality, the tone of a man who had learned something he intended to keep. Ruth turned from the stove. Yes, she said. All of that. He looked at her. You were already thinking the same thing. Since November, she said. He almost smiled. She went back to the stove. Eli came in from the barn and sat down and ate his breakfast and said that the cow with the hurt foreleg was better. The one that had gone lame in February, on the ice in the barn doorway. Thomas said that was good. Ruth said she was glad. They ate in the ordinary way of a family on a March morning. The talk about the farm and the animals and the work of the week. And it was ordinary in the way Ruth had not felt it be ordinary in a long time. The specific ordinariness of a household that was not managing a crisis. After breakfast, Eli stayed at the table. Thomas went out. Ruth washed the bowls and waited. Eli said, I want to tell you something. She dried her hands and sat down across from him. He had the look he had when he had been thinking about something for a long time and had decided the time for thinking was over. I wrote to Jacob Whitfield, he said. Last week. She waited. I told him I am not going in April. Ruth looked at her son. I told him I might go later. Eli said, in a year or two, when I have saved more and when the farm is steadier. He paused. I told him, the farm needs another season first. Ruth said, is that the reason? The farm. Eli met her eyes. He was honest, the way she had raised him to be honest. And honesty with Eli meant he did not dress things up to sound better than they were. That is part of the reason. He said, the other part is that I am not ready. I thought I was in August. I was angry in August. At the summer and the frost and all of it. And I think I wanted Ohio to be something to be angry toward. He looked at his hands on the table. I do not want to go toward something out of anger. I want to go because it is the right time and the right choice. Ruth looked at her son for a long moment. That is a wise thing to know about yourself. She said, you knew it. He said, in August. You did not say it, but you knew. Yes, she said. I knew. Why did you not say it? She looked at him. Because you had to know it yourself. If I had told you, it would have been my knowledge. You would have argued with it. You do not argue with things you have figured out yourself. Eli was quiet. Then he said, that is a particular kind of patience. Yes, she said. It is. He nodded and got up and went out to join Thomas in the east field, where the fence still needed 2 posts reset from the winter heaving. Ruth sat at the table alone for a moment. She thought about April and what she had written in the account book in September. April. Decision needed, and about how the decision had made itself in the end. The way decisions did when you gave them the time they required. She got up and went to start the morning bread. The last week of March came in warm. the air above freezing by 9 in the morning, and staying there through the afternoon. The snow gone from everything but the shadowed places along the north fence line and the hollow at the base of the big maple. The creek was running full with snowmelt, the sound of it coming to the house on the right wind, and the mud in the yard was beginning to firm at the top as the water drained away. May came home from school on a Wednesday and went straight through the house and out the back door without stopping, leaving her coat on the peg and her school bag on the floor by the door and her boots outside the kitchen. And Ruth heard her running across the yard and did not call her back. She was barefoot. Ruth heard the slap of bare feet on the thawing ground, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched her daughter run to the edge of the north field and stop there and stand with her face up and her arms out a little from her sides, the way children stood when they were trying to take in something too large to take in all at once. The field was still bare, too early for planting. The dark soil caught the afternoon sun and gave it back as warmth, the kind of warmth you could feel from a distance, the kind that meant the ground was ready to begin. May stood at the edge of it for a long time. Ruth watched her. She thought about May at the window in June, watching the snow on the corn and asking if summer had come yet. She thought about May in October in the church pew, pressed against Ruth's side. She thought about May in January with the fever, asking if the light outside was different, and being told that a mountain on the other side of the world had no fences in the sky between itself and Vermont. May turned and ran back to the house. She came through the kitchen door, pink-cheeked and slightly out of breath, and went to the table and sat down. "The ground is warm," she said. "Not yet," Ruth said, "but getting there. I could feel it on my feet," May said. "The top is cold, but underneath it is warm. I could feel it coming up." Ruth looked at her daughter. "That means it is ready," May said. "Doesn't it?" "Almost," Ruth said. "A little longer." May nodded. She reached for the bread on the table and ate a piece and looked out the window at the north field in the afternoon light, settled into the look she sometimes had when she was done asking questions and had moved on to simply knowing things. Ruth went back to the bread she was making. Ely and Thomas came in at dusk, cold and tired and with the particular satisfaction of men who had gotten a necessary thing done. Thomas said the fence posts were in, solid this time, packed deeper than before. Eli said he thought they would hold through the next winter without resetting. They washed their hands. They sat down. Ruth put supper on the table. It was a simple supper, the supper of a family at the end of a long winter. The stores reduced, but not gone. The meal enough and not abundant. The bread good and the salt pork from the last barrel and the beans from the stoneware crocks that Patience Wheeler's mother's method had kept good through the winter exactly as Patience had promised. They ate. The fire was going. The lamp on the table made its small circle of light in the March dark outside the windows. The creek sound came and went on the wind. After supper, May helped clear the table without being asked. She carried the plates to the basin and came back and wiped the table with the cloth, and then she sat back down and looked at her father. "Papa," she said. Thomas looked up. "Can we plant the north field first?" "Like always?" Thomas looked across the table at Ruth. Ruth looked at him. Something passed between them in that look. Not long, just a moment. But it carried the weight of the year behind them, and the spring ahead, and the particular knowledge of two people who had stood together through something difficult and come out on the other side, still standing. "Yes," Thomas said to May. Northfield first. Like always. May nodded. She seemed satisfied with this, the way she was satisfied by things that confirmed that the world was going to do what the world was supposed to do. She got down from the table and went to get her school book. Ruth watched her go. The account book was in the drawer. The seed corn was in the jar on the cellar shelf. The maple run was done, and the syrup was in its crocks, and the fence posts were set deep in the east field, and the ground under May's bare feet was warm from below. Tomorrow Thomas would go out to the north field and press his palm to the ground, and it would be what he needed it to be. Or it would not yet be what he needed it to be. And they would wait another few days. Either way, the checking would happen the way it had always happened. And the planting would happen when the ground was ready. And the corn would go in. And the sky above Vermont in the spring of 1817 would be what the sky above Vermont was supposed to be. She believed this, not with the unexamined certainty she had carried into 1816. The certainty of 9 good years that had never been tested, with something different, something earned, the belief of a person who had watched the worst and come through it and was choosing, with full knowledge of what could go wrong, to plant again. That was a different kind of belief. She thought it might be the only kind worth having. The morning of the planting was the kind of April morning that Vermont sometimes offered as a kind of apology for the length and difficulty of its winters. Clear and still, and with a warmth in the air, by 8 o'clock that was unmistakable. The real warmth of a season that had arrived on time and intended to stay. Ruth was at the kitchen door before anyone else was awake. She was holding her coffee in both hands. The way she held it on the mornings when she came out before the house was moving, when the only sounds were the birds starting up in the maples, and the creek running in the low ground below the east field, and the fire she had built an hour ago, settling in the kitchen behind her. The north field was in front of her. The soil was dark and turned. Thomas and Eli, having worked it through the last week of March and into the first days of April, breaking the winter crust and working the clods down to the fine, dark tilth that good seed needed. The rows ran straight from the kitchen door to the tree line the way they had run every spring for 9 years. The apple tree at the far end was in bloom, white flowers against the blue morning. The bees already working it this early in the day. She looked at the field. She thought about standing here in June of the year before, looking at the snow on the young corn and knowing what she knew and not saying it to Thomas, because saying it would make it real in a way the morning did not yet require. She thought about August and the frost on the tassels, and the conversation at the kitchen table with the account book open between them. She thought about November and the 3 letters spread on the table and the back pages of the account book and the name she had written there, and then not underlined because she was not certain enough to underline it. She thought about all of it, and she looked at the north field in the April morning, and she drank her coffee. The chair beside the door was there. Eli's chair. He was upstairs, still sleeping, which was where he was supposed to be. On a morning when the planting was not until after breakfast, he was here, in this house, which was where he had decided to be. For now, she did not know what the year after this one would bring, or the year after that, whether Ohio would call to him again when the farm was steadier, or whether Vermont would be enough. She had learned, in the year just past, that not knowing a thing was not the same as being unready for it. She heard Thomas on the stairs. He came through the kitchen and out the door and stood beside her. He smelled of the barn, the early morning barn check already done, and he poured his own coffee from the pot she had left on the step, and stood next to her and looked at the field. They stood, without speaking, for a while. The sun came over the tree line. It came the way it was supposed to come in April, at the angle April required, and the warmth it brought was the warmth of a sun that was doing what the sun was supposed to do. She felt it on her face and her hands and the tops of her boots, the particular pressure of actual warmth, the kind that had meaning for seeds in the ground, and for a woman who had spent a year watching the sky and learning not to trust what she saw. She trusted it this morning. Not completely, maybe not ever completely again, but enough. Thomas said, "Ground looked good yesterday." "Yes," she said. "Should turn dry enough by noon." "Yes." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The bees worked the apple tree. The creek ran below the east field with its full April voice. Somewhere in the maple grove, a woodpecker was at work on a dead branch, the sound of it coming across the still air in clean, regular strokes. "I have been thinking about what you said," Thomas said. "In December, about what the farm is for." She waited. "You said it was for us, and for May, and for the work itself." He paused. He was looking at the north field. "I have been thinking that you were right. I made it into something it was not. For a while, made it into a verdict on myself." He was quiet for a moment. "It is not a verdict. It is a farm." Ruth looked at her husband. "It is a good farm," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." They stood with that for a while, the two of them, in the April morning, the field in front of them and the house behind them, and the 20 years of their life together in the air between them, like something that did not need to be named, because it was already fully present. May came out. She came through the kitchen door barefoot, as she had been going barefoot since the last week of March, every chance she got. Her coat over her nightgown and her hair loose from sleep. She looked at her parents standing at the door, and then she looked at the north field, and then she went and stood at the edge of it and pressed one bare foot into the turned soil, the way Ruth had seen her press her foot into mud and snow and creek water, with the full attention of a child who trusted her feet to tell her things. She stood there a moment. "It is ready," she said. She said it the way she said things she was certain of, without a question in it. Thomas looked at Ruth. Ruth said, "Yes, I think it is." Eli came down. They heard him on the stairs, heard him in the kitchen, heard the door. He came out pulling his coat on and looked at the three of them at the edge of the north field. He looked at the field. He looked at the apple tree in bloom at the far end. He looked at the sky, as he had looked at the sky all summer and fall and winter, but differently this morning. The looking of a person checking, rather than the looking of a person afraid of what he might find. The sky was clear. The sun was up and warm and doing what the sun in April was supposed to do. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked back at the field. "Where do you want me to start?" he said. Thomas said, "First row, east end." "Same as always." Eli nodded. He went to the barn to get the seed. Ruth went inside. She went to the drawer and took out the account book and opened it to the back pages. She read through them from the beginning. From the entry in March of 1816, maples not running. She read through all of it. The haze, and the wrong light, and the snow on the 6th of June, and the second frost, and the harvest numbers, and the 3 letters, and the names she had written in November. She read the entry from February. Maples are running. She read the last entry. We will see what the sky does. She turned to a fresh page. She sat for a moment with the pen in her hand, listening to Thomas and Eli in the north field. The sounds of the first row going in, the particular sound of seed corn dropping into turned earth, that she had been hearing every spring for 9 years, and that she had not been certain, in August of the year before, that she would hear again. She wrote the date, April 1817. She wrote, "The sky is clear. The seed is going in. The maples ran on time." She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line. Not a conclusion, not a summary of what the year had been, or what it had cost, or what it had taken from them and left behind. Just the thing that was true, the simplest and most honest thing, the thing she had learned, in the way you only learned things when they had been tested all the way through. She wrote, "We are still here." She closed the account book. She put it in the drawer. She went outside. The north field was being planted. Thomas at one end and Eli at the other, working toward each other the way they worked when the job was large and the day was good. The seed going into the dark soil in the morning light, the rows filling in behind them. May was at the edge of the field with her bare feet in the turned earth, not helping, just present the way children were present at the things that mattered, absorbing it without knowing they were absorbing it, the way they absorbed everything that would later turn out to have been important. Ruth walked out to the field. She stood at the end of the first row, and she looked down the length of it, the dark earth, and the straight line of it running back to the apple tree in bloom. She looked at the sky above the tree line, clear and blue and doing nothing unusual. The sun at its April height and warm on the back of her hands. She reached down, she picked up a handful of soil from the end of the row and held it in her palm. She pressed her thumb into it. She felt the give of it, the grain of it, the particular way it held together under pressure and fell apart when released. Good soil, the same soil it had always been. She let it fall. She looked at the sky one more time. It was only the sky. It was only April. The season ahead was unknown, and the winter after that was unknown, and the years beyond that were unknown, in all the ways that years were always unknown, in the ways that could not be prepared for, and the ways that could. She would watch. She would count. She would keep the account. The sun did not remember. 1816. It had risen on that year, and set on it, and risen again on the year after, and it would go on, rising without memory or mercy, without any knowledge of what it had withheld and what it had given back. But Ruth Carey remembered. She would remember the scale on the kitchen table, and the back pages of the account book, and the 3 letters spread on the table on a November evening. She would remember June 6th, and the snow on the corn, and May asking if summer had come. She would remember Thomas sitting with the numbers in the September light, and Eli at the end of the corn row, setting down a dead stalk and looking at his hands. She would remember because it was hers to remember, and she would plant because it was hers to plant. She walked out into the field to help her family get the seed in the ground. Behind her, the kitchen door stood open. The fire was going. The account book was in the drawer, with everything written in it that needed to be written. The apple tree held its white flowers up to a sky that was, this April, exactly what an April sky was supposed to be. The seed went into the ground. The season began.